Chapter 1. The Visitor in the Fog. It was in the bleak November of the year 89 that the singular affair of the glass-eyed man first presented itself to my attention, an affair which, despite its extraordinary circumstances and the delicate nature of its revelations, I have at last obtained permission to recount in these pages. The matter, though one of the most curious in my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, has never before seen the light of day, for reasons which will become evident to the discerning reader as the narrative unfolds. That morning the fog lay thick upon Baker Street, one of those dense yellow mists which cling to the lamplighter's poles, and render even the most familiar thoroughfare a shifting dreamscape of shadow and vapor. From the window of our sitting room at 221B I could discern nothing save the blurred outline of the opposite houses, ghostly and distorted through the veil of smoke. The fire burned cheerfully in our grate, casting a warm glow upon Holmes, who sat cross-legged upon the rug, his long, thin fingers manipulating a piece of twine and a bent paper clip with the utmost concentration. "You will observe, Watson," said he without raising his eyes, "that a knot once tied by a nervous hand can betray far more about its author than the handwriting of a dozen letters." "Indeed, Holmes?" I asked, laying aside the morning paper. "And what does this particular knot tell you?" "That its maker was left-handed, that he suffers from a tremor induced by excessive use of chloral, and that he is or was a sailor in His Majesty's service." I could not help but smile. "You have derived all that from a loop of twine?" "From the loop, from the tightness of the hitch, and from the curious fraying of the end," said he, holding it up to the light. "Elementary, my dear Watson, though I do not expect Scotland Yard to adopt my methods any time soon." Before I could frame a reply, there came the sound of hurried footsteps on the stair. Mrs. Hudson's knock followed almost immediately upon the door, and a moment later she ushered in a man whose aspect was so remarkable that even Holmes, usually the least impressionable of observers, sprang to his feet. He was tall, spare, and exceedingly pale, with a high bald forehead and a pair of deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unnatural brightness. But what most drew one's attention was the left eye, a glass one, fashioned with uncommon skill, yet lacking that subtle luster of life which distinguishes the natural organ. The stranger's clothing, though of good material, was disordered and travel-stained. His gloved hands trembled as he removed his hat, and the faint odor of damp fog and cab smoke hung about him. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume?" said he in a low voice curiously uneven in tone. "My name," Holmes replied, bowing slightly, "and this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray be seated. You appear to have been in haste." "I have indeed," said the man, dropping into the chair by the fire, "and I fear I bring with me a tale both perplexing and perilous. I come, sir, from the South Bank, from Lambeth, where last night a most dreadful occurrence took place." Holmes resumed his seat, his keen eyes fixed upon our visitor. "Pray continue, Mr. Dunwoodie, Edmund Dunwoodie, formerly of the merchant firm of Chiswell and Grant." Holmes inclined his head. "I am listening, Mr. Dunwoodie." The man moistened his lips before continuing. "It is concerning the death of my associate, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon. He was found this morning, dead in his chambers. The police say it was suicide. I swear it was murder." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Murder? And upon what do you base that assertion?" "The condition of the body, sir, and the evidence that was overlooked. Penhaligon was found with a revolver in his right hand, yet he was left-handed. Furthermore, the door was locked from the inside, but the key was missing. The constable declares the matter simple. I declare it impossible." "Indeed," murmured Holmes. "A locked room, a missing key, and an inversion of handedness. A promising trinity." Mr. Dunwoodie's glass eye seemed to fix upon Holmes with a curious intensity. "There is more, Mr. Holmes. A note was found upon the desk, a few words scrawled in haste. He sees through glass, what others cannot. No one can make sense of it." For a long moment Holmes said nothing. His gaze drifted to the fire, and I could see by the faint tightening of his lips that his great mind was already weaving its net. "Watson," said he at last, "you recall the case of the Musgrave ritual? A key hidden in plain sight, and the curious incident of the engineer's thumb, where a simple machine betrayed a complex crime. This affair may prove of similar stripe." He turned suddenly to our visitor. "You spoke of a glass eye, Mr. Dunwoodie. Forgive the intrusion, but was your friend, Mr. Penhaligon, in possession of such an article?" "Indeed not," said Dunwoodie, surprised. "Why do you ask?" Holmes rose, pacing the length of the hearth-rug. "Because, sir, there are but few references in English literature to seeing through glass that are not metaphorical, and fewer still which end in tragedy." The man passed a trembling hand across his brow. "You speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes. Can you help me?" Holmes halted abruptly, his eyes alight with the old fire. "Help you? My dear sir, you have brought me precisely the sort of case that quickens my blood. I shall go to Lambeth this very afternoon." He turned to me. "Watson, your revolver and your overcoat, if you please. There is mischief afoot in the fog." Within the hour we were in a hansom, rattling southward through the thickening mist. The driver's lamp glowed faintly in the gloom, and the clatter of hoofs echoed hollowly from the cobbles. Holmes sat in silence, his lean face half shadowed by the rising fog. Once or twice he muttered to himself, then fell again into abstraction. At last, as we crossed Westminster Bridge, he spoke. "You observed our visitor's eye, Watson?" "Impossible not to." "Quite so. And you noticed the tremor in his hand?" "Yes, though I attributed it to anxiety." "Perhaps, or perhaps not." Holmes leaned forward, his voice lowering. "It is my conviction that our Mr. Dunwoodie knows far more of this business than he confesses." There was a moment as he spoke of the note when his pulse quickened, and his good eye betrayed fear, not of murder, but of discovery. "Discovery of what?" I exclaimed. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we shall endeavour to find out." We descended shortly thereafter at a gloomy cul-de-sac off the Lambeth Road, where a cluster of police officers and curious onlookers stood before a narrow doorway. A constable recognized Holmes at once, and with a deferential touch to his helmet, ushered us upstairs to a chamber dimly lit by the afternoon murk. The room was orderly, too orderly, as Holmes observed, save for the writing desk, upon which lay a revolver, a few scattered papers, and a small mirror cracked across its face. Upon the floor near the hearth lay a single cuff-link, gold with a design I could not make out. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, Watson," said he softly, "the game is afoot once more." And so began the case of the glass-eyed man, a case which was to test even Holmes's formidable intellect, and which would reveal, before its end, the most singular deception I have ever witnessed in the whole course of my acquaintance with that extraordinary man. Chapter 2. The Locked Room in Lambeth. Of all the innumerable rooms which my friend and I have inspected in the course of our adventures together, few return to me with greater clarity than the chamber in Lambeth where the unhappy Arthur Penhaligon met his end. I can close my eyes and conjure it. The narrow stair with its threadbare runner, the smell of damp plaster peculiar to houses that lean into the river fog, and the door at the landing, upon which a smear of soot lay over the brass key-plate, like the imprint of a gloved hand. The constable's lamp, set upon a hall table, cast a thin beam which fluttered at each movement, so that the very shadows seemed to breathe. "Here we are, gentlemen," said the constable, a solid fellow with a bulldog jaw. "The doctor's seen him. Inspector Lestrade's on his way. I'm told to admit you, Mr. Holmes, provided you do not hinder the arrangements." Holmes inclined his head with that chilly politeness which, I confess, seldom endeared him to the police. "We shall not hinder, my good fellow. We shall leave that to Scotland Yard." He passed over the threshold as lightly as a cat, with me close upon his heels. The room itself was of modest dimensions, furnished with respectable economy. A writing desk by the window, a coal grate with 2 kerosene lamps upon the mantel-shelf, a narrow bed with a grey woolen coverlet, and upon a small occasional table, a porcelain jug and basin for washing. A braided rug lay between hearth and desk. The window was curtained, the panes made milkier by the fog beyond, and the cheap gasalier overhead gave a thin greenish light, which did nothing to improve the aspect of the corpse. Penhaligon lay on his right side, half in shadow, half illuminated by the gas flame, his cheek pressed against the braided rug as if listening at the floor for secrets. The revolver was still in his right hand. There was dried blood upon the temple, and a dreadful black aperture where the bullet had entered. A stiff lock of brown hair, matted and clotted, stuck to the skin. I could not look upon it for long. Holmes did not spare the sight, however. He knelt as if in prayer, though no man was less given to that exercise, and bent until his face almost touched the dead man's. "Ah," he said softly, "cordite. Also, Watson, your nose." I leaned down, expecting the same sharp scent of powder. Instead, beneath it, I detected a faint medicinal tang, not unlike a hospital corridor newly wiped down, an odor scarcely perceptible but unmistakable to one who has walked the wards. "Carbolic," I said, "very slight." Holmes's eyes shone. He brought his magnifying lens to the wound, then to the man's lips, then to the palm of the right hand that clutched the revolver. "Permit me," he murmured, and with a white linen kerchief which he produced from his pocket, he delicately lifted the hand and examined the web between thumb and forefinger. "There are powder marks," I said, "but not so prominent as I have seen." "Just so," said Holmes. "And more to the point, note that the powder grains are not driven into the skin, as they would be were the muzzle in close contact and the discharge his own." He relinquished the hand, which fell back with a terrible boneless resignation. "We shall not be hurried, Watson. The dead do not move." He rose and crossed to the desk. There lay the revolver's case, open and empty, a second kerosene lamp, 2 sheets of notepaper blotched and torn, a pen laid across the stand as carefully as a surgeon's scalpel, and a small hand mirror, its silvered face cracked from end to end, as I have already told. Beside these, on the blotter, was the note which had so perplexed our visitor. "He sees through glass what others cannot." Holmes bent over the message. He did not touch it, but he sniffed it, which seemed to me absurd until he said, almost to himself, "A viscous black ink, perhaps Stevens blue-black in its older Terry formulation. The pen is a fine nib, recent, though the hand which guided it is unpracticed or agitated. No blotting. No, that is of interest. I had the habit, gained through years in his company, of not pressing him when he uttered such oracular sentences. Instead, I allowed my gaze to wander to the hearth. The grate was warm. A coal had broken into petals of red that winked and sighed. On the iron fender, no more than a foot to the right of the opening, there was a smear of some pale substance, like dried wax, scarcely larger than my thumbnail. I stooped to it. "Holmes," said I, "does this—" "Aha!" He was instantly at my side. "Do not touch it, Watson. Remember the lesson of the Bishop of Chichester's ring." He knelt, brought his lens to bear, and uttered a pleased little grunt. "Paraffin, I think. The same smear appears here on the lower hinge of the desk, and again— where? We shall see." He stood and surveyed the room, his gaze flicking to the bed, the jug, the gaselier, then to the window. He crossed in 3 steps and examined the sash. "Locked within," he said, "by its common safety catch. The dust upon the sill is disturbed. 1-2 streaks. But that may be from the constable's clumsy elbow. The fog would keep any witness from seeing either in or out. Look at the pane, Watson." I looked and saw nothing. It was only when he adjusted the angle of the curtain with extreme care that a faint oval smudge announced itself on the glass, the size of a man's eye pressed close. "Very good," said Holmes. "A man has looked outward in a hurry. Which man? And when? The eye leaves its own signature, but alas, the fog has effaced the finer strokes." He returned to the desk. "He sees through glass what others cannot. Curious." There came at this point a brisk rap upon the jamb, and in swept Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. his sharp features and bird-like brightness curiously out of keeping with his short, square figure. He beamed at Holmes in a manner that told me he had already made up his mind. "Well, Mr. Holmes and Doctor," he said cheerfully, setting his bowler on the desk with an assurance that made me wince, "I have to thank you for keeping your hands to yourselves. You arrive, as usual, just in time to second my conclusion." "Which is?" Holmes returned blandly, "that Mr. Arthur Penhaligon took his own life. Here are the facts as we have them. He was found within a room secured from the inside. There is a revolver in his hand. There is a message which, if it is not a confession, is at least a sign of a deranged mind. He was heard by the charwoman to be walking about at 2 in the morning, talking to himself. The door was locked when she returned at 7. We forced it on the orders of the sergeant and found him, as you see." "A trifling difficulty," said Holmes, "if you would do me the favor of explaining the absence of the key." "Thrown into the fire," Lestrade replied promptly. "That is plain enough. The coals were shoveled afresh. It is lost in the ash." Holmes's eyelids drooped. "And the loose cuff-link upon the floor?" "A gentleman's trinket, dropped days ago," said Lestrade with a wave of the hand. "It's his, no doubt." Holmes picked it up between thumb and forefinger. It was oval, of yellow gold, and bore upon its face a minute device, which I could not resolve until he tilted it to the gas. Then I perceived what seemed to be a tiny eye, an oculus, surrounded by rays like the sun in a child's picture. "Not unhandsome," said Holmes, turning it. "But your hypothesis, Inspector, requires that a left-handed man shot himself with his right hand. I am willing to believe much upon your authority, but I confess that strains my allegiance." "How do you know he was left-handed?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes half smiled. "If you will examine the inkwell and the placement of the pen, the wear upon the desk surface, the direction of the nib's scratch upon the already blotted paper, and most of all the callus upon the first phalange of the left forefinger of the deceased, which you, naturally, have already done, you will not question the fact." "No." "Well then," Lestrade coloured slightly, "a man in his extremity is not neat in his choice of hands. Besides, there is the note. It is nothing but the ravings of a mind unbalanced by business reverses." "Business reverses?" Holmes's voice sharpened by a hair's breadth. "Yes. Mr. Penhaligon and a certain Mr. Edmund Dunwoody, you may have heard of him, a fellow with a glass eye, had come lately into disputes at their firm, Chiswell and Grant, about a consignment gone astray. There were whispers of irregularities, a quarrel at their offices on Monday, and yesterday an interview with their shipping clerk, who has since vanished. These matters prey upon a man." Holmes's long fingers began their customary steepling. "Your knowledge does you credit, Inspector. You have spoken to this Mr. Dunwoody?" "I have not yet laid eyes on him, though he sent for you. We shall be calling on him shortly." "You will find him in possession of excellent manners," said Holmes lazily, "and of a most interesting ocular contrivance. Meanwhile, if you are content to play the host, allow me half an hour with your photographer, and a decent sieve." "A sieve?" "The fireplace," Holmes said, as if to a child. "No hearth willingly devours a brass key." Lestrade gave a short, incredulous laugh, but he sent a man for a sieve all the same. While we waited, Holmes moved about the chamber in his restless, silent fashion. He examined the gaselier with a tenderness that would have befitted a bridegroom. He knelt at the bedside and slid a hand beneath the mattress, bringing forth a tiny puff of dust and the skeletal remains of a moth. He measured the distance from rug to desk with the length of his foot, and finally, with a singular delicacy, he lifted the cracked mirror and peered at its back. "What do you make of that mirror, Watson?" he asked, offering it to me. "It is of shoddy construction," I said, turning it to the light. "The silvering is poorly applied. The crack suggests a blow." "From within or without?" "The crack runs from the upper right to the lower left," I said. "Were a man standing before it to strike it with his right hand, the blow would likely fall from left to right. This seems from the other side." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Very good, my dear fellow." He set the mirror down and took from his pocket a little cylindrical tin. From this he shook a dusting of grey powder upon the desk surface near the note, then breathed very lightly. A constellation of minute specks sprang into visibility, arrayed along the edge of the blotter and across the polished wood. "Now who, I wonder," he murmured, "has such a habit of resting his fingers precisely thus while leaning to read? Not our corpse, his hand is too large. Not Lestrade, for he has not yet been to this side of the desk. Our constable. No, the shape is different, and here. No, do you see, Watson, the impression of a ring, not on the usual finger, but upon the smallest? Only a woman wears a ring thus, and only a very particular kind of woman would wear one so thin. Here is our sieve." We gathered at the hearth while Lestrade's man, a lank youth with ears like sails, sifted the ashes into a pail. After a minute of dreary scraping, there came a metallic clink. The youth grinned and held up his prize, a brass key, discolored but intact. Holmes took it with a little bow. "You see, Inspector, your fire is not the glutton you supposed. Now does it fit?" It did. Lestrade himself inserted it into the keyhole of the inner door, then turned it. It engaged cleanly. He stared, baffled. "Thrown in after the fact," said Holmes lightly, "by someone who desired to strengthen the appearance of suicide. But there is a difficulty. The door was locked from within, you said? The bolt is simple. The key must also have been within." Lestrade squared himself. "A string, then, through the keyhole. I have seen such tricks in penny dreadfuls." "Have you indeed?" Holmes's voice took on the dry amusement which I had come to treasure. "Then you will allow me to direct your attention to the keyhole. Observe that it is fitted with a dust cap which, if lifted from without, would have left a crescent of smut upon the plate. No such trace exists. The string, therefore, did not pass through. How then? Another device, one that required a little paraffin and a cool head." He glanced sidelong at me and then away, as if catching himself upon the brink of explanation. "But come, it is yet early." Lestrade made a vexed noise. "You are forever a step ahead with your conjuring. If you have a theory, Mr. Holmes, pray give it." "I have an hypothesis," Holmes returned. "A theory requires proofs. At present I have only a picture in fragments, but of one point I am certain. The hand that wrote that message is not the hand that habitually wrote in this room." "How the deuce?" "Because," said Holmes, "I have eyes, and I use them. At that moment there came a tap at the open door, and a woman's face appeared, pale, narrow, with red-rimmed eyes, and a cap that had once been white. She curtsied clumsily. "Beg pardon, sir," she said. "I'm Mrs. Biddle. I do for Mr. Penhaligon. They told me as Mr. Holmes was here. Can you, sir?" "Oh, poor gentleman." Holmes's manner altered at once. He can be as gentle as any man when the situation calls for it. "Pray, Mrs. Biddle, be seated. We shall not keep you long. You say you do for him. You cleaned here yesterday?" "Yes, sir, in the afternoon. He was not himself, not of late. Walking the floor he was, and speaking to himself under his breath. And Mr. Dunwoody with him the day before, the gentleman with the fine hat and the eye." "Did Mr. Dunwoody come often?" "Not so much of late. There were words, sir, and then Mr. Penhaligon told me not to admit him if he should call again unless he gave his name Finch. I asked no questions, me being a respectable woman." "Finch?" Holmes repeated. "An odd bird. And was there any other visitor?" The woman's eyes flicked to the desk. "Only the lady, sir." Lestrade pricked up his ears. "Lady? A fine one. Came in a carriage, she did, just at dusk, and went straight up. She had a veil and spoke soft-like. I offered tea, but she would not have it. She was here no more than half an hour." "What day?" Holmes asked. "Yesterday, sir. I left them alone. When I returned to say I was away to my sister's for the night. She is poorly, sir. She was gone, and he was writing. I never saw him alive again." "Did you know aught about her hands?" Holmes's question was so sudden and so pointed that the woman started. "Her hands?" Mrs. Biddle screwed up her eyes. "They was pale and small, sir, and she had a little ring on the last finger, no bigger than a wire." Holmes flashed me a glance. "Thank you. You are a most observant woman. If you would give your direction to the inspector, you will be sent for again." When she had gone, Lestrade could no longer keep his exultation bottled up. There, Mr. Holmes, a lady, a quarrel, a note, and a locked door. It is plain as print. He was undone by his own despair. Holmes looked at him as a schoolmaster looks at the boy who has recited his lesson with confidence but without understanding. Your zeal is commendable, Inspector. For myself, I never accept print that has been set by an unknown compositor. Watson, your hat. We shall take the air. The air? Lestrade repeated, astounded. Where are you going now? To consult with a man who is both blind and sees. Come, Watson, we have a small appointment in St. Martin's Lane, and then I propose a visit to the offices of Messrs. Chiswell and Grant. Blind and sees? I asked as we descended the stairs. Holmes's lip barely moved. An optician, my dear fellow. Did you not mark the pattern on the cufflink? The Eye and Sun is the signboard of Quarles, the lens maker. If Penhaligon has dealings with Quarles, we shall hear of it. And if not, the mark tells us someone in this room had. We emerged once more into the yellow murk of the afternoon, where the lamps were already glowing like pale moons in the fog. Holmes hailed a hansom with his peculiar whistle, and handed me in. As we jolted away, he sank into that deep silence which, more than any speech of his, proclaimed the labour of his mind. Lestrade will pursue his lady, I ventured after a time. He will, Holmes said, for she is meant to be pursued. Meanwhile there are 3 inconsistencies which will not be reconciled with suicide: the carbolic taint, the arrangement of the desk, and— He tapped lightly at his breast pocket, where I now noticed he had secreted some small object in the course of our inspection. This. What is it, Holmes? He looked through me rather than at me, as if I were a pain and the greater marvel lay beyond. A trifle, he said. And yet, my dear Watson, trifles are the hinges upon which great doors turn. Let us see whether this one unlocks Lambeth, or merely opens upon another chamber of mystery. He did not explain further, and I knew him too well to press him. The wheels rattled, the horse's breath steamed, and the city's innumerable voices were muffled to a dull susurrus by the fog. Beside me Holmes sat like an image cut from grey stone, his profile severe, his eyes far away. Thus, in the twilight of that singular day, did we set out upon the first real steps of the inquiry, into the tangle of glass and gilt, and the curious company kept by men who look through lenses for a living, and yet fail to see what is immediately before their noses. Chapter 3. The Lens-Maker of St. Martin's Lane. Our cab drew up before the narrow frontage of Quarles & Sons Optical Engineers, situated in that curious part of St. Martin's Lane where instrument-makers, antiquarians, and purveyors of curiosities seem to share the same melancholy air of faded precision. A brass telescope, long disused, projected above the door. The signboard beneath, painted a decade ago at least, showed an eye enclosed by rays of gold, and beneath it the words, "Makers to the Royal Observatory." The bell tinkled as we entered, and at once the dry metallic odour of ground glass and brass polish filled our senses. The shop was a dim, low-ceilinged place, crowded with shelves of ocular instruments, lenses of every size, microscopes in mahogany cases, little spectacles with coloured filters, and a phalanx of optical contraptions whose purpose even I could not divine. A single gas jet burned behind a frosted shade, its light softened to amber by the dust motes which drifted lazily in the still air. Behind the counter stood an elderly man of minute stature, stooped like a drawn bow. His hands, surprisingly delicate, were polishing the rim of a brass monocular tube. The head was bald, save for a white fringe about the temples, and the eyes, when he looked up, were quick and shining as a sparrow's. "Mr. Quarles?" Holmes inquired. The old man inclined his head, and the gesture brought with it a subtle dignity. "My late father, sir, was Mr. Quarles. I am his son, John Henry. You will forgive the confusion. What can I do for you?" Holmes leaned upon the counter, his keen gaze darting from the instruments to the man himself. "I am told you designed artificial eyes of uncommon workmanship, eyes that not only restore symmetry, but serve, in some cases, to magnify or correct the remaining vision. Am I rightly informed?" A flicker of pleasure crossed the man's lined face. We have had success in that direction, yes. The principle of the concave lens, you see, can be combined with a mirrored backing to create both appearance and aid to focus, provided the remaining optic is functional. But our customers are few: sailors, soldiers, those maimed by accident or war. Holmes nodded. You have perhaps supplied one such to a Mr. Edmund Dunwoody of the firm of Chiswell and Grant? At the mention of the name, the old optician's polishing cloth faltered for the briefest instant. Mr. Dunwoody? Yes. Some months ago. A most exacting gentleman, if I may say. He commissioned a glass eye of a special type with an inner convex of smoked tint. He said it helped him in bright light. And did it? Holmes asked, his tone light but his glance sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. I cannot say. He was pleased with the fit, but I recall he returned once or twice for adjustments. He complained that it reflected light too readily, that others could see, as he put it, what was behind him. Nonsense, of course, though it amused my father vastly. Did he speak of Mr. Penhaligon? The old man frowned. No, I think not. But he came once in the company of another gentleman, dark-haired, shorter, with a nervous manner. He seemed reluctant to be seen. It was not Mr. Penhaligon, if that is your question. Holmes leaned closer. Describe him, if you please. I recall only that he had a slight cast to one eye, and a faint mark here. He touched the side of his neck, as though from a burn. He spoke little. Mr. Dunwoody did the talking. Would you recognize him again? The old man hesitated. Perhaps. But it has been some months. Holmes's gaze drifted to a shelf where several cases stood. You keep records, of course. Measurements, specifications, fittings? Yes, sir. Every client is noted in our ledger. Holmes's long fingers came together. Would it inconvenience you to consult it? Not in the least. The optician vanished through a curtain, and we heard him moving about, drawers opening and closing. Holmes turned to me, his eyes alight. Watson, do you mark the peculiarity? A glass eye that reflects what is behind. There is symbolism enough in that to furnish a sermon, and yet perhaps not mere metaphor. What do you suppose he meant by it? Patience, my dear fellow. We are still in the vestibule of the temple. Mr. Quarles returned bearing a ledger whose pages were yellowed and filled with neat copperplate entries. He laid it upon the counter and turned the leaves with fingers that trembled slightly. Here, Dunwoody Edmund, fitting May 23rd. Returned June 5th for adjustment. Specification: left orbital shell, grey iris, inner convex with polished backing. What my father called mirror core. Holmes bent over the page. And payment? Half in cash, half by draft on Chiswell and Grant. All duly settled. Holmes nodded. Thank you. You have been most obliging. The old man looked from him to me with a puzzled expression. Is there mischief afoot, sir? I would not wish our craft to be associated with any— On the contrary, Holmes said, slipping a card across the counter. Your assistance may prove invaluable in disentangling a very grave one. Should any person inquire after this same pattern of eye, or return it for alteration, I beg you to send immediate word to this address. The optician promised, and Holmes bowed himself out. Once in the fog-draped street, he thrust his hands deep into the pockets of his Inverness cloak and strode northward at a pace which forced me to half-trot beside him. Well, Watson, said he presently, what do you make of that? Dunwoody's vanity, perhaps. A curious contrivance to render his defect less visible. Vanity, yes, but mixed with something subtler. The mirror core intrigues me. Imagine, if you will, a convex surface within the socket. Such an eye, properly angled, might, with the aid of a lens, allow a man to perceive movement behind him, however faintly. You think it possible? Not likely, he admitted, but suggestive. A man who believes he can see what is behind him might well act upon that belief, and in doing so, betray himself. We had turned into the Strand, that ceaseless artery of London's heart, where omnibuses lumbered like elephants and newsboys darted among the cabs, shouting of crime and scandal. Holmes halted suddenly before a stationer's window. Observe, Watson, advertisements for photographic chemicals, the very solvents whose odor I detected at Lambeth. Carbolic, yes, but also collodion. There was collodion in that room. I'd stake my violin upon it. What would collodion signify? Photographic preparation, a coating for plates or for glass. He smiled thinly. Do you recall the cracked mirror? It was no ordinary mirror. It had been recently treated. For photography. I stared at him. Then Penhaligon was engaged in some experiment with glass and light. Yes, whether innocent or otherwise remains to be seen. But the note, he sees through glass what others cannot, begins to take on a new complexion. We continued in silence for some minutes, the fog curling about our ankles like smoke. Presently Holmes hailed another cab. To the offices of Messrs. Chiswell and Grant, said he to the driver. We shall pay by the clock. There is no better tutor than haste. The premises of Chiswell and Grant occupied the upper floor of a respectable building near the river. A brass plate proclaimed them export merchants in fine instruments and chemical goods. We were shown into a dim counting room where a young clerk sat at a high desk, poring over ledgers. His ink-stained cuffs and nervous manner bespoke a man long overworked. Mr. Chiswell is absent, sir, he stammered when Holmes inquired. Mr. Grant attends to the books, but... He hesitated. We have been much disordered since the death of Mr. Penhaligon. Ah, said Holmes smoothly. You were acquainted with him. I was but his clerk, sir, though a good master he was. Poor gentleman, none deserved such an end. You are of the opinion it was self-inflicted. The young man's eyes widened. The police say so, but I cannot believe it. He was troubled, yes. That Dunwoody affair weighed upon him, but not to such despair. Holmes motioned him to continue. It was some matter of shipment, the clerk said. A crate of optical glass, I think, bound for Rotterdam. The bills of lading went missing. Mr. Dunwoody swore Penhaligon had forged them, and Penhaligon swore the opposite. Words were said, loud ones. Then 2 days later the crate was found opened, the glass gone. Stolen? Or exchanged, I cannot tell. There was talk of fraud, but Mr. Penhaligon said the matter would be set right if only he might have one more night to prove his innocence. And now? He shook his head. He is dead. Holmes's eyes had narrowed. This crate, where was it stored? In our cellar, sir. It was sealed under Mr. Dunwoody's direction. Holmes straightened. Watson, I think we must view that cellar. The clerk led us down a narrow stair that smelt of dust and river damp. At the foot was a small vault lit by a single oil lamp. Against one wall stood several wooden crates, some open, some nailed fast. Upon one of these Holmes's gaze fixed instantly, a box half sawn open, its lid askew. The stenciled letters upon it read, Flint Optical Glass. Quarles & Sons, London. He bent, pried loose a slat, and drew out a thin plate of glass. It was not clear like ordinary glass, but faintly iridescent, with a bluish sheen that seemed to ripple across its surface like oil on water. Watson, said he quietly, hold it to the light. I did so, and to my astonishment saw that the lamplight was oddly refracted, forming twin shadows upon the wall, one faint, one distinct. A split image, Holmes murmured. Precisely as I hoped. He replaced the pane and turned to the clerk. Was all the glass of this sort? I believe so, sir. Holmes dusted his hands. Then, my dear fellow, you are employed by a firm that traffics not in goods, but in secrets. Keep your tongue and your conscience close. Come, Watson. The fog grows thicker, and we have much to think upon. It was not until we were again in the cab, the river's murmur muffled beneath the clatter of wheels, that Holmes spoke. Consider, Watson, a murdered man who worked with glass that splits light, a partner with an artificial eye of Miracore, and a note that speaks of seeing what others cannot. Does it not suggest some method of reflection, literal or moral, whereby one man has turned another's invention against him? You believe Dunwoody guilty, then? I believe him to be afraid, Holmes said gravely, and fear, my dear Watson, is a more transparent lens than any fashioned by human hand. He leaned back in the gloom, his hands clasped, his face lost in thought. Tomorrow we shall pay our glass-eyed gentleman a visit, but tonight I must test a theory. What theory, Holmes? He smiled faintly, his eyes glinting through the shadows. That the dead may yet look back through glass, if one knows how to see. And with that enigmatic declaration, we rattled off into the thickening London night, the fog swallowing cab and thought alike, while the faint gleam of a cracked mirror seemed to hover still before my mind's eye. A silent watcher, waiting for the next revelation in the case of the glass-eyed man. Chapter 4. The House of Mirrors. I had grown accustomed over the years to Holmes's habit of beginning a new day as though the previous night's enigmas had been quietly solved in his sleep. When I came down to breakfast the next morning, the gaslight still dim against the pale London drizzle, I found him already at the table, the remains of a hasty meal pushed aside, and a curious arrangement of apparatus occupying his place. A small lantern, a convex lens, a piece of cracked mirror, the very one he had taken from the Lambeth chamber, and beside these a narrow vial of clear fluid which emitted a faint odor of ether. "Good morning, Watson," said he briskly, without looking up. "You will forgive me for depriving you of the bacon. I required a clear flame. Observe." He adjusted the mirror upon its edge, angled the lantern through the lens, and produced upon the wall a faint but distinct image, the reflection of the room itself, dim and ghostly, yet with one curious feature. The right-hand corner appeared doubled, as though two images were imperfectly aligned. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "That is the same effect we saw with the glass from the cellar." "Precisely. I have coated the reverse of this mirror with a trace of collodion. It becomes what photographers call a wet plate, sensitive to light. It would seem that our late Mr. Penhaligon was experimenting with just such a technique. But for what purpose?" Holmes smiled that small, secret smile which always meant he was nearer the truth than he wished to admit aloud. "To see what others cannot, Watson. You recall the inscription? The clue lies not in metaphor, but in optics. Penhaligon discovered a means of producing partial reflection, a surface that both reveals and conceals. Imagine a room where one may look in, yet those within see only themselves. Such a device, in unscrupulous hands, could be most profitable." He snuffed the lantern and replaced the mirror carefully in a paper envelope. "We shall require fresh air before facing our glass-eyed friend. Finish your coffee. Lestrade has kindly agreed to meet us in Lambeth by noon, though I doubt he will thank us for our interference." I smiled ruefully. "He seldom does." "True," said Holmes, "but he does so with increasing civility." The return to Lambeth. By midday the rain had ceased, but the fog remained, that stubborn yellow-grey vapor that seems to rise from the very pores of the city. The streets glistened like varnish. Horses moved with ghostly deliberation, their harnesses muffled. When we arrived at the same cul-de-sac as before, Lestrade was waiting near the door of the late Penhaligon's lodgings, his coat collar turned up, and his expression one of thinly veiled impatience. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," said he, "you're just in time to hear that I have traced your mysterious lady." Holmes's brows rose. "Indeed. Indeed. Her name, it appears, is Mrs. Clara Sloane, formerly of Kensington, recently residing in rooms off the Waterloo Road. She was acquainted with the deceased through charitable work. At least, so she says." Holmes gave a low whistle. "And you believe her?" Lestrade shrugged. "She was distraught, certainly. Claims she came to persuade him to surrender some papers relating to a business matter. The rest, she says, she knows nothing about." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "And what of Mr. Dunwoodie?" "Not yet found. His manservant reports he left his house in Russell Square 2 nights ago and has not returned. There is talk of illness, but I think it more likely he's slipped the leash. Scotland Yard has him on watch." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Then we are in agreeable accord for once, Inspector. A missing man, a dead one, and a woman who prefers the dark to daylight. The trifecta of all good mysteries. Come, let us see what Our Lady has to say." Lestrade looked as though he might object, but curiosity got the better of him. "Very well. I've a cab waiting." Mrs. Clara Sloane. The rooms in Waterloo Road were housed in a decaying Georgian terrace, its paint the colour of old bones. The landlady, a thin woman with a face like a withered apple, admitted us after much whispering and protest that the poor lady had only just lain down. Nevertheless, a few minutes later we were shown into a small parlour where Mrs. Sloane awaited us. She was a woman of perhaps 35, dressed in mourning black, her veil drawn but not wholly concealing a face of remarkable refinement. The eyes were grey and restless, the hands, clasped upon her lap, delicate and pale. When she looked up and saw Holmes, she started visibly. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a low voice, "you come concerning Mr. Penhaligon?" "Among other things, madam," Holmes replied gently. "Pray accept my condolences. You were acquainted with him?" Her composure wavered. "Yes. We met last year through my late husband's business. Mr. Penhaligon was always kind. Too kind, perhaps. He assisted me when I had nothing." "Assisted you in what way?" She hesitated. "He loaned me a small sum. Later he asked me to sit for him. He said he was experimenting with light through glass, that he wished to capture reflection, not image. It was very strange. There was a mirror, and behind it—" She stopped, colour draining from her face. "Pray continue," said Holmes softly. "I cannot," she whispered. "I was sworn to secrecy. He said that what we did that night must never be spoken of, that there were men who would kill for it." Lestrade leaned forward, his tone sharper. "Mrs. Sloane, you were in his rooms the night he died. Did you see another person there?" She shook her head. "No one. I left him alive, writing at his desk. He seemed afraid, not of me, but of something he had seen." Holmes studied her closely. "Seen, you say? In the mirror?" She shivered. "Perhaps. I only know he kept looking over his shoulder, as though the glass showed something behind him. When I asked what he feared, he said, 'He is watching, always watching.'" Holmes's eyes flicked to Lestrade. "He? Did he name this watcher?" "No, but he spoke of Mr. Dunwoodie, said the man's eye was not what it seemed." "Ah," murmured Holmes, "a mirror to spy upon mirrors. Thank you, Mrs. Sloane. You have been of great assistance." She caught his sleeve suddenly, her voice trembling. "If you find who did this, but promise me you will not speak my name. There are letters, papers, etc. He told me to burn them. I did as he asked." Holmes patted her hand. "Your name shall not be uttered by me, but one final question. Did you by any chance notice a small mark upon his desk? A smear of wax, perhaps?" She looked startled. "Yes, he had a candle with a peculiar white flame, and when it burned it left that waxy film. He said it was part of his experiments with transparency." Holmes nodded gravely. "That confirms my suspicion. Thank you, madam. Rest assured, your secret is safe." The fog returns. Outside, Lestrade was frowning beneath his bowler. "What the devil do you make of that? A candle, a mirror, and an invisible watcher. It's as mad as alchemy." "On the contrary," said Holmes, stepping into the fog. "It is science, Inspector, perverted by greed. I begin to see the shape of the thing. A partnership in optics. Penhaligon the inventor, Dunwoodie the financier. The glass in their shipment was no mere merchandise. It was part of Penhaligon's work. Lenses capable of both reflection and vision. He trusted Dunwoodie, and Dunwoodie betrayed him." Lestrade sniffed. "And your proof?" "It will come as light comes through glass. Gradually. For now we must visit Russell Square." The glass-eyed man's house. The house of Edmund Dunwoodie stood in dignified gloom behind a line of iron railings, its windows shuttered despite the noon hour. A sour-faced servant admitted us after some delay, muttering that his master was not receiving visitors. Holmes brushed past him with such authority that the fellow gave way without another word. The drawing-room into which we were shown was dark and close. A fire smouldered on the hearth, unpoked. Upon a side table stood several instruments, microscopes, prisms, and a small wooden case fitted with velvet. Holmes opened it. Within lay a second glass eye. "Two!" he murmured. "One in his head and one in reserve. Note the difference. This one lacks the mirror core. A spare, perhaps? Or a prototype?" Lestrade examined it uneasily. "Looks ordinary enough to me." "Precisely," said Holmes. "And that, Inspector, is what makes it suspicious." At that moment there was a faint sound overhead, the creak of a floorboard. Holmes froze, every sense alert. "He is here," he whispered. He moved toward the staircase, and we followed. The landing above was dim, but from beneath a door at the far end came a sliver of light. Holmes approached softly, motioned us back, then turned the handle. It yielded. The room beyond was an inferno of clutter. Glass plates, mirrors, chemical bottles, photographic apparatus, and at its center, hunched over a table, sat Edmund Dunwoody himself. He looked up as we entered, and for an instant the gaslight struck his glass eye, so that it flashed like a coin. His face was pale, his lips dry, his hands stained with something dark. "Mr. Holmes," he said hoarsely, "I thought you might come." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Then you also expected the police?" Dunwoody gave a broken laugh. "They will not understand. Penhaligon stole from me, not I from him. He would have ruined us both with his damned invention." Holmes's tone was cold as frost. "You mean the mirror that sees, the same mirror before which he died." Dunwoody's hand trembled. "It was my idea. He perfected it, yes, but he meant to sell it abroad. To spies. I only meant to frighten him. The revolver—" He broke off, burying his face in his hands. "Enough," said Lestrade. "You'll have every chance to explain yourself at the Yard." Holmes's gaze, however, remained fixed upon the desk. "Watson, observe. The paraffin again, and a thin filament stretched from the keyhole to this armature. Ingenious. A mechanism to lock the door after firing the shot, by the heat of a candle melting the line." Lestrade gasped. "Good Lord, so it was murder." Holmes straightened, his eyes blazing. "A murder dressed as suicide, executed by reflection. The gun fired by design, the key replaced with artifice, the killer unseen behind glass. Mr. Dunwoody, you have spun a fine web, but you forgot that even the best mirror cannot hide a man's face from his own conscience." Dunwoody said nothing. He had collapsed against the table, staring into the cracked remains of a half-silvered mirror, his own distorted reflection staring back. One eye real, the other shining like an unholy lamp. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You may take him, Inspector, but handle him gently. His punishment has already begun." Epilogue to the chapter. We left the house in silence, the fog swallowing us as though London herself sought to hide the ugliness of what she bred. Holmes walked with his hands behind him, his head bowed, until we reached the square. "You have solved it, then?" I said quietly. "Partly," he replied. "But there remains a question. Who first conceived the mirror? Penhaligon or Dunwoody? The motive may lie deeper still." He glanced toward the lamps, where their glow was faintly doubled by the mist. "In this city, Watson, truth is like light through glass. It bends before reaching the eye. One must adjust one's angle or see only distortion." He hailed a cab. "Come, my dear fellow, there is one last visit to make. To Quarles, the lens-maker. The true heart of this mystery may lie not in what was seen, but in what was made to be seen." And thus ended that grim afternoon, with Holmes already one step beyond comprehension, and I, as ever, hurrying in his shadow through the endless, fog-drenched labyrinth of London. Chapter 5. The Man Behind the Glass. Sleep eluded me that night. The events of the day, the discovery of Dunwoody in his laboratory, the revelation of that infernal mechanism, the strange light that burned in his solitary eye, replayed themselves endlessly in my mind. I had seen many strange things in Holmes's company, but there was something peculiarly dreadful in this affair. It was not merely a matter of murder, but of a mind warped by its own creation, a crime born of vision itself. When I came down in the morning, the fog still clung to Baker Street like damp wool, but within our familiar sitting-room the fire burned brightly. Holmes was at his chemical table, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a pair of spectacles perched precariously upon his hawk-like nose. The table was strewn with mirrors, fragments of glass, and a shallow dish in which some translucent solution fumed faintly. "Good morning, Watson," he said without turning. "I trust you slept soundly?" "Soundly enough." "To dream of mirrors and eyes," I replied, seating myself by the fire. "Lestrade wired this morning. Dunwoody remains in custody, but he raves continually about what lies behind the glass. They fear he may lose his reason altogether." Holmes made no reply. He was holding a glass plate to the light, peering through it with the concentration of a watchmaker. "Holmes," said I at last, "you are not satisfied. I can see it in your face." He smiled faintly. "You are improving in observation, my dear Watson. Indeed, I am not satisfied. Dunwoody's guilt is patent, yet it is not complete. He did not devise the apparatus that killed Penhaligon. He merely used it. The true ingenuity lies elsewhere." "You mean someone else built it?" Holmes nodded. "Last night, after leaving you, I visited the optician Quarles once more. I found the old man locked in his workshop, terrified, poor soul, and with good reason. Someone had been there before me?" I started. "A burglary." "An intrusion," Holmes corrected. "The drawers had been rifled, papers scattered, and one of the ledgers gone, the one containing his designs for a series of lenses marked Noctis. That word, Watson, means of the night. It appears our Mr. Penhaligon and his partner were not alone in their experiments." He lifted the plate from the dish and held it over the firelight. A thin film had formed upon its surface, iridescent like oil upon water. "This," said Holmes, "is a reproduction of Penhaligon's glass, or very nearly. Observe how it both reflects and transmits. A man standing before it believes he sees a simple mirror, but if another stands behind in a darkened chamber, he may look through it as though it were a pane of clear glass." I gasped. "Then Penhaligon's room was no sanctuary at all. He was being watched, Watson, watched through the very mirror he trusted." For a long moment I could only stare at him. "But who could have watched him?" "Dunwoody." Holmes shook his head. "Dunwoody is a fool, not a craftsman. He would not have the skill to silver such glass, nor the patience to calibrate it. No, the hand that fashioned these lenses is older, more practiced. It was Quarles himself." "Quarles!" I exclaimed. "But the man is nearly 70. Age does not dull obsession. He was once a man of reputation, a pioneer in optical chemistry. He spoke to me yesterday of his father's methods with an almost religious reverence. I believe he continued those experiments, in secret and under the pretext of simple craftsmanship. Penhaligon was his pupil, Dunwoody his financier. The tragedy of this case, Watson, is not malice but hubris. Each man saw only what he wished to see, and thus all were blind." He turned from the table and began to pace, his long fingers tapping together. "There is one final proof required. The missing ledger. If it has not been destroyed, it will show the progression from innocent lens-making to espionage." "Espionage? Think of it, Watson. A mirror that allows one to see unseen. Imagine its value to the foreign offices of Europe, or to the baser intrigues of commerce and politics. It would be a tool fit for a king, or a blackmailer." He stopped abruptly and glanced toward the door. "We shall call upon Quarles at once. I fear, however, that we may be too late." The optician's confession. The rain had resumed by the time we reached St. Martin's Lane. The little shop looked even more forlorn than before. The windows were shuttered, the brass telescope dripping with moisture. Holmes knocked twice. There was no reply. He tried the handle. It yielded. The interior was dim, lit only by the pale glow of a shaded lamp at the counter. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and metal. Then from the back room we heard a faint cough. "Mr. Quarles?" Holmes called. The old optician emerged slowly from behind the curtain, his spectacles glinting. He looked 10 years older than when we had last seen him. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I feared you might come." Holmes advanced gently. "You have been robbed, Mr. Quarles. Your ledger is missing." The man's hands trembled upon the counter. "Yes. Gone. Taken last night. They came while I slept. 2 of them. I heard voices in the shop, but when I rose, they fled. Only the broken window remains." Holmes's gaze swept the room and fixed upon a heap of splintered glass near the door. He crouched, examined it, then drew out a small fragment. "Aha! The same iridescent film. And here, Watson, a trace of wax from a candle. They used the same infernal method." Quarles sank into a chair. "I never meant harm. I swear it. My lenses were to serve art and medicine, to help surgeons see, to teach scholars. Then Penhaligon came with his enthusiasm and his grand designs. He said we could perfect the mirror that both shows and hides. I warned him it was dangerous. He laughed. His voice broke. When he died, I knew. I knew it would come to this. You cannot gaze through the world without the world gazing back." Holmes regarded him gravely. "Who came last night, Mr. Quarles?" "I do not know. One was tall, perhaps foreign. The other, I thought for an instant I saw the gleam of a woman's hand." Holmes's head snapped up. "A woman?" "Yes. She wore gloves, but the motion, it was delicate, deliberate. They took the ledger and left in haste. I was too afraid to follow." Holmes straightened. "Watson, we are dealing with something far more intricate than I feared. There is a 4th player in our game. The woman in the carriage." As we stepped into the lane once more, a hansom cab drew up at the corner. Through the misted window we glimpsed a pale face. A woman's, veiled, her gloved hand resting upon the frame. For a fleeting moment Holmes's keen eyes met hers. Then the curtain dropped. The whip cracked, and the carriage vanished into the fog. "Did you see?" I cried. "I did," said Holmes grimly, "and I have no doubt who it was." "Mrs. Sloane." "Precisely. She has the ledger. She lied to us yesterday when she claimed to have burned the papers. She was not Penhaligon's victim, but his accomplice, and perhaps his betrayer. There are women, Watson, who wield sentiment as a mask for intellect. Mrs. Clara Sloane is of that rare and dangerous breed." We pursued the cab as best we could, but the fog closed around it like a curtain. After several futile turnings, Holmes halted at the edge of Covent Garden, his expression one of icy calculation. "She will not go far," he said at last. "A woman burdened by guilt seeks safety and familiarity. Her rooms in Waterloo Road will be empty, of course, but she has another refuge, the studio where Penhaligon conducted his experiments. Then we must go there." He shook his head. "Not yet. Darkness will serve us better. The kind of light she needs for her work is the kind that thrives in night. Come, Watson, we shall prepare our own illumination." Night in Lambeth. It was near midnight when we returned to Penhaligon's chambers. The police had sealed the door, but Holmes, with his customary disregard for protocol, produced a slender key of his own devising, and admitted us silently. The fire had long gone out. The room was cold, the air heavy with dust and dread. Holmes lit a shaded lamp and set it upon the desk. The broken mirror still hung upon the wall, its fractured surface reflecting our twin images like spectres. "Watson," he whispered, "stand here, and do not move." He crossed to the window, drew the curtain, and extinguished the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. Then through the silence came the faintest rustle, as of fabric against wood. "There," Holmes murmured, "behind the wall." I strained my ears and indeed caught a faint creak. Holmes moved like a shadow to the hearth, his hand upon his revolver. Suddenly he thrust aside a hanging coat and pressed upon a panel I had taken for solid plaster. It swung inward soundlessly, revealing a narrow recess, and within it, by the light of a small lantern, stood Mrs. Clara Sloane. Her face was ghastly pale. The missing ledger was clutched against her breast. "Do not move, madam," said Holmes. "The game is finished." For a heartbeat she hesitated. Then her shoulders sagged, and she stepped forward, the light gleaming upon the tears that filled her eyes. "You are too late, Mr. Holmes." she said quietly. He is dead, and what he made dies with him. I have destroyed the formula. Destroyed it? Holmes repeated. She nodded. I burned it tonight before you came. The mirror that sees. It must never exist again. It cost Arthur his life, and Edmund his soul. Holmes regarded her with that curious mixture of pity and admiration I had seen him reserve for only the most extraordinary of women. And you, madam? What did it cost you? My heart, she whispered, for I loved him, though I betrayed him. I thought Dunwoody would spare him if I gave him the secret. Instead, he killed him. I can never atone. For a moment, none of us spoke. The fog pressed against the window like a living thing, and the single flame of her lantern flickered across the shards of the mirror, scattering her reflection into 100 trembling ghosts. Holmes took the ledger gently from her hand. You have done wisely, he said. There are inventions the world is not fit to possess. Then, turning to me, he added softly, Fetch Lestrade. Our case, I think, has at last resolved itself, though not perhaps to any man's satisfaction. Epilogue to the chapter. When Lestrade arrived some 20 minutes later, Mrs. Sloane made no resistance. She was taken away quietly, her veil drawn once more across her pale features. Holmes watched from the window until the cab vanished into the mist. Holmes, I said, you believe her story? He sighed. I believe she told us the truth at last, or as much as any mortal ever does. The ledger's ashes will tell no tales, but her conscience will. As for the mirror, it is broken, and let it remain so. He turned back to the fire, his face half in shadow. You see, Watson, the danger of such devices lies not in their making, but in the minds of men who would look too closely. The more clearly one sees, the less clearly one understands. I said nothing. Outside the fog was lifting, and a weak dawn crept over London, pale, uncertain, as though the city itself feared what new reflections it might reveal. Chapter 6. The Reflection That Would Not Die. It was several days before the storm surrounding the so-called Lambeth Mirror murder subsided. The newspapers, starved for sensation, devoured every detail that Lestrade and his superiors allowed to slip through their fingers. The Morning Chronicle declared it a crime of scientific sorcery, while the Standard proclaimed Holmes a mystical detective who reads truth in glass. Holmes, of course, ignored all of it. He was deep in one of those silences that rendered him to all outward appearances an automaton of thought, moving, eating, even smoking purely by reflex while his mind roamed elsewhere. I confess the conclusion of the case left me uneasy. Though Mrs. Sloane's confession had cleared many points, there lingered a shadow, a sense of unfinished business. Dunwoody had died suddenly 2 nights after his arrest. Apoplexy, said the jailer. The ledger was gone to ashes. Quarles had shut his shop and left London for the seaside. Yet Holmes was not satisfied. There was something more, some unseen hand behind the mirror's invention that gnawed at him. It was upon the 4th evening after Mrs. Sloane's imprisonment that the matter took its next and most sinister turn. Visitor in the night. The fog had returned, that dense, smothering kind that muffles sound and turns the gas lamps to dull moons. Holmes had been playing his violin for an hour, wandering between melancholy and fury in his bowing, when a sudden knock came at our door. Mrs. Hudson, long used to unusual hours and odder visitors, admitted a small, elderly gentleman wrapped in a black cloak. His face was sharp and colourless, his eyes as pale as misted glass. Holmes, who had set down his violin, greeted him with a slight bow. Mr. Quarles, unless my eyes deceive me. The optician inclined his head. You are correct, Mr. Holmes. Forgive the lateness of my call, but I could not rest until I had spoken with you. I am haunted, sir. Haunted not by what has been done, but by what remains undone. He took the chair Holmes offered and pressed a trembling hand to his brow. I was not entirely truthful when we last met. There was another set of plans, not in the ledger Mrs. Sloane burned, but in a separate volume. I hid them. They were my father's designs upon which all our work was based. Holmes's eyes sharpened. You hid them. Where? "In Penhaligon's rooms," Quarles whispered. "Behind the mirror. I thought them safe, for who would look there? But the mirror is broken now, and others may suspect." "Others?" Holmes repeated. "You mean Mrs. Sloane's associates?" The old man nodded. "She was not alone in her fascination. There were men, foreign men, who offered gold for our secret. They promised nothing, asked everything. I fear they will not rest now." Holmes rose, pacing the rug with that swift, restless stride I knew too well. "And you come to me tonight because you believe they will seek those plans?" "I do not believe," Quarles said. "I know, for this was left upon my doorstep this morning." He drew from his cloak a scrap of thick white card. Upon it, drawn in ink so black it seemed to absorb the light, was the same symbol we had seen upon Dunwoodie's cufflink, the all-seeing eye surrounded by rays. Beneath it was scrawled a single phrase in an angular foreign hand. "Through glass, we are all watched." Holmes examined it without a word. Then, to my astonishment, he struck a match and burned the card to ash. "Mr. Quarles," he said quietly, "you will spend the night here under my protection. Watson, see to our guest's comfort. I have an engagement." "An engagement?" I cried. "At this hour?" "Precisely because of this hour," he said, drawing on his coat. "The night conceals many watchers, and I intend to see which of them peers through our glass this evening." And before I could utter another word, he was gone into the fog. The shadow at the window. It was near midnight when Holmes returned. His boots and coat were wet through, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "As I suspected," he said, shaking the damp from his hat, "we are not yet rid of our mirror makers." He threw a small parcel upon the table and unwrapped it. Within lay a shard of glass, smooth on one side, silvered on the other, its edge cut with extraordinary precision. "This," he said, "I found at the rear window of Penhaligon's lodgings. Someone has been there tonight." I glanced at Quarles, who had dozed uneasily by the fire. The old man stirred, muttering, "They will not stop. They will not stop until the lens is made anew." "Who are they, Mr. Quarles?" I pressed gently. He lifted his head with a strange, feverish gleam in his eyes. "A society. I do not know its name. They came first as patrons, collectors of rare optical instruments. They spoke of art, of science, but their questions were not those of artists. They wanted to see without being seen. When I refused, they turned to Penhaligon, and now they have the glass." Holmes nodded slowly. "The symbol, the radiant eye, suggests a cult of vision. It has appeared before, Watson. The Ordo Speculorum, a cabal obsessed with the notion that every truth in the world is hidden in reflection. I encountered its traces once in Paris. The society was thought dissolved years ago." "You think they have returned?" "I think they never left." He turned to Quarles. "We must reach those papers before they do. Will you accompany us?" The old man hesitated, then rose shakily to his feet. "Yes. Better they perish by my hand than fall into theirs." The return to Lambeth. Once more we made our way through the labyrinthine fog to Lambeth. Holmes moved with the swiftness of a hound on scent, pausing only once to consult a small compass he drew from his pocket. "Southwest wind," he murmured. "They will have come by the river." The house where Penhaligon had lived loomed from the mist like a tomb. Its windows were dark, save for a faint flicker in the upper chamber. Holmes extinguished his lantern and motioned for silence. We ascended the stair in darkness, each board seeming to creak like a whisper of warning. At the landing he paused, crouching low. A thin line of light showed beneath the door, the same door that had once concealed the body. A shadow moved across it. Holmes leaned close to my ear. One man, possibly two, armed. He drew his revolver, then pushed the door open with a sudden thrust. The scene within froze in a single instant of dreadful clarity. Two men stood by the broken mirror, the shards of which had been removed from the wall and laid carefully upon the desk. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other slight and wearing a dark cloak. At the sight of us, the smaller man cried out and reached for something within his coat. Holmes's pistol barked once, and the object, a small vial of clear liquid, shattered upon the floor, releasing a pungent metallic odor. "Hold, gentlemen," Holmes commanded. "You will find the exits rather inconveniently watched." The taller of the two men sneered in a foreign accent. "You meddle in matters beyond your understanding, Mr. Holmes. The mirror belongs to those who can use it." "Indeed," Holmes said, his voice like steel, "and yet you handle it with the delicacy of a thief rifling a dead man's pockets." The man lunged suddenly, but Holmes was quicker. In an instant he had seized the intruder by the wrist and sent him sprawling. Lestrade, who, it transpired, had followed us on Holmes's invitation, burst through the door with 2 constables. In moments the pair were secured. As the light of the constables' lanterns filled the room, Quarles crept forward, his eyes fixed upon the shattered fragments with something between reverence and horror. "So much beauty," he murmured, "and so much evil." Holmes knelt beside the desk, his gaze sweeping the wreckage. "Here, Watson." The hiding place. He pried loose a small wooden panel behind the mirror's frame, revealing a narrow compartment. Within lay a thin sheaf of papers, yellowed and fragile. He handed them silently to Quarles. The old man's hands shook. "The last of my father's work," he whispered. "It must end here." Holmes nodded solemnly. "And it shall. Lestrade, see that these men are removed. I shall attend to the rest." When the police had gone, Quarles gathered the papers, fed them one by one into the fire, and watched as the flames consumed them. The light danced across his face, illuminating eyes that seemed both relieved and sorrowful. When the last page had turned to ash, he rose slowly. "Now it is done," he said. "No more eyes behind glass." Holmes placed a hand upon his shoulder. "Let us hope so." The eye that remained. We left the house as dawn began to creep through the fog. The river shimmered faintly like molten lead. Holmes walked in silence, his hat pulled low, the ghost of fatigue upon his features. At length I said, "You have destroyed the invention. The case is over." "Over." He gave a short laugh. "Nothing in this world, my dear Watson, is ever truly over. Destroy the glass, and another will learn to polish it anew. The human appetite for unseen knowledge is infinite." He paused upon Westminster Bridge and gazed down at the sluggish Thames. "Still, we have bought the world a little blindness. And sometimes," he added softly, "it is better not to see." I followed his gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw, far below in the slow grey current, a faint glimmer, as if a single shard of mirror drifted just beneath the surface, catching the first light of dawn. When I turned to point it out, Holmes had already moved on. Chapter D. The Eyes of the Dead. I must beg my reader's indulgence if in recounting this final and most dreadful phase of the glass-eyed affair my pen falters, and my recollection grows uncertain. There are cases, even in the career of so singular a man as Sherlock Holmes, where the boundary between logic and terror becomes so fine that one wonders in later years whether it was truly crossed at all. The events that followed our encounter in Lambeth left me with that impression, that we had stood upon the very threshold of something unseen, something that watched us, and which might yet be watching still. The restless dead. It was 3 nights after the capture of the so-called Mora thieves that the first of the strange occurrences began. Holmes had gone out late, as was his habit, leaving me to doze before the fire with a medical journal. I had just laid it aside when a sharp rapping came at the window. Thinking it some vagrant or drunken cabman, I rose irritably, but when I drew back the curtain I saw no one. Only the faint reflection of my own face stared back from the glass. Then, and I confess my hand trembles even now as I write it, that reflection moved. For an instant I was certain that the image blinked. I recoiled, blinking myself, and the illusion vanished. There was only the fog beyond the pane, and the faint lamplight of Baker Street. But even as I tried to laugh at my own nerves, the sound of a key turned softly in the lock behind me. Holmes entered, hat and coat glistening with moisture, and stopped short when he saw my expression. "My dear fellow," he said mildly, "you look as though you had seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," I said, forcing a smile. "At least my own. This fog plays tricks on the nerves." Holmes removed his gloves slowly, his eyes upon me. "The fog," he said, "or something that watches through it." I stared. "You cannot mean—" He raised a hand. "I mean that we are not yet done with this matter, Watson. The thieves taken in Lambeth were mere agents, the lesser mirrors, if you will, reflecting the design of a greater mind. Something remains." "Something?" Holmes seated himself by the fire, the flame casting angular shadows upon his lean features. "2 nights ago the bodies of our prisoners were found in their cells, dead. No wound, no sign of struggle. The jailer swears the door was locked from within. Their faces were contorted as though they had died in terror, and each had one eye, the right, filmed over with an unnatural glaze. The coroner could find no cause." "My God," I whispered. "Lestrade is convinced it is coincidence. I am not. I have seen this before, in the archives of Paris, in connection with the same accursed emblem. The all-seeing eye, the Ordo Speculorum, Watson, has re-emerged. The relic of Penhaligon." Before I could frame a reply, Holmes rose abruptly and went to his desk. He drew open a drawer and produced a small, velvet-lined box. Within it lay the fragment of mirror he had recovered from Lambeth, now cleaned and mounted in a thin brass frame. "I kept this," he said, "against my better judgment. I wished to study its structure. Observe." He held it up to the lamplight, angling it slightly. The glass was faintly iridescent, its surface shimmering like the skin of a bubble. At a certain angle one could see through it. At another it reflected perfectly. Holmes turned it slowly in his hand. "A triumph of optics," he murmured, "and a curse of the spirit. The same combination of reflection and refraction that enables this glass to reveal both sides also creates a phenomenon I can scarcely account for. A secondary image, faint but persistent, that forms even when no light source exists." He lowered the mirror and looked at me keenly. "Do you see it, Watson?" I leaned forward. For an instant, only an instant, I thought I did. A faint shadow, a suggestion of a human outline behind my own reflection. Then it was gone. "It is some optical illusion," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Holmes said softly. "And yet, if illusion, why has it appeared in rooms far from here? Quarles himself swore that the same image haunted his shop before he fled to Brighton. He described it, a tall man, one eye gleaming as if made of glass." A chill crept up my spine. "You think—" "I think," Holmes interrupted, "that Penhaligon's invention, in its destruction, has birthed something that cannot easily be buried. The glass may be shattered, but the image remains. The eyes of the dead, Watson, do not close so easily." The visit to the morgue. The following day we were summoned to St. Thomas's Hospital, where the bodies of the 2 dead thieves lay. The coroner, a brisk young man named Dr. Bellamy, greeted us with relief. "I am glad you're here, Mr. Holmes," he said. "The matter is beyond ordinary medicine. Look for yourself." He led us to the cold chamber. The corpses lay side by side beneath white sheets. When the cloth was drawn back, I started involuntarily. The faces were pale as wax, the mouths contorted in silent cries. But it was the eyes, or rather the single eye of each, that froze my blood. The right orb was clouded over with a milky film, yet beneath that film there glimmered faintly what seemed to be silver, as though a mirror lay within the flesh itself. Holmes bent close, his expression grave. "Have you examined the vitreous humor?" "Yes," said Bellamy. "Perfectly clear. But the cornea appears to have been silvered from within. No known chemical could produce such an effect." Holmes straightened slowly. "Unless," he said, "it was produced not by a chemical, but by an idea." The coroner blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Forgive me," said Holmes. You deal in the tangible, Doctor. I sometimes must deal in the reflected. These men died of fear, but not ordinary fear. They looked upon something no man should see. He turned to me. Watson, you recall how Penhaligon stared at his mirror in those final hours. What if the glass reflected more than image? What if it reflected conscience itself? To one steeped in guilt, such a reflection might be intolerable. You speak as though the mirror were alive. Holmes's lips thinned. Perhaps it is, in this sense that fire is alive, or a contagion. It feeds upon those who feed it. Remember the motto on Dunwoodie's cufflink. He sees through glass what others cannot. The Ordo Speculorum believed that in reflection lies the true soul. They sought to make the mirror see back. The final reflection. That night Holmes worked without pause. The mirror fragment lay upon the table, surrounded by his retorts and lenses. I watched in silence, though unease gnawed at me. At last, near 3 a.m, he straightened with a sigh. I have reached a conclusion, he said. It is neither scientific nor sane, but it is the only one that fits the facts. He gestured to the glass. This fragment retains within it a residual image, a kind of optical echo. When the eye of a man falls upon it, the reflection lingers, infinitesimally imprinted upon the surface. Enough of these imprints, superimposed, and one might produce an apparition, not of the living, but of those who have looked before. I stared at him in horror. Then, yes, Holmes said quietly. We are all in some measure recorded by our reflections. The mirror remembers. He lifted the shard, turned it to the firelight, and for the briefest instant I saw, or thought I saw, another face beside his own, the gaunt glass-eyed visage of Edmund Dunwoodie, smiling faintly through the shimmer. Holmes hurled the fragment into the fire. It cracked, hissed, and was gone. There, he said, the last of it. Now, perhaps, London may sleep unobserved once more. He sank into his chair, exhaustion written upon every line of him. I could find no words. Outside, the fog rolled past the window like smoke from the pyre of some ancient offering. When at last I turned to bid him good night, I saw that the polished surface of his violin case, standing beside the hearth, still caught the firelight, and in its reflection, for just an instant, 2 figures sat where only one should have been. Chapter the 8. The Man in the Mirror. The dawn that followed was one of those wan London mornings that seems to creep rather than rise, the light pale and reluctant, the very air fatigued with its own greyness. Holmes had not slept. I found him still seated by the fire when I rose, the remnants of tobacco ash scattered across the hearthrug like the residue of some secret rite. He greeted me with a brief nod, his eyes heavy but burning with that inward fire I knew so well. Watson, he said, you may congratulate yourself upon surviving the night. Surviving? I echoed. My dear Holmes, surely the peril has passed. The glass is destroyed, the thieves are dead, Mrs. Sloane and Quarles are safe. What danger remains? Holmes smiled faintly, a smile with no mirth in it. The same danger that faces every man who looks too long into his own reflection. The peril of seeing not what is, but what waits behind it. He rose abruptly, went to the window, and flung it open. The cold air swept into the room, driving out the lingering smoke. I have been considering, Watson, why this case should trouble me more than any other. The facts are clear, the culprits accounted for. Yet the mind recoils, as if some unfinished question remains. And what question is that? Whose eye first looked through the glass? He turned to me then, and I saw that exhaustion had deepened the lines of his face. I tell you in confidence, my dear fellow, there was a moment last night when I doubted the evidence of my own senses. When I hurled that fragment into the fire, I saw, unmistakably saw, another face reflected beside my own. Not Dunwoodie's, as you claim to have seen, but one older, colder, and infinitely more knowing. Holmes, I cried, you have been too long without rest. These fancies— Perhaps, he cut me off gently. Yet fancies, Watson, have an awkward habit of becoming facts when one follows them far enough. A call from Scotland Yard. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegram. Holmes tore it open, scanned it, and passed it silently across the table. It was from Lestrade. Quarles found dead at Brighton. Circumstances identical to Lambeth thieves. Eye discolored. Request your presence immediately. I read the words twice before I could speak. Holmes, this is monstrous. You saw the man yourself, frail, terrified, incapable of harm. Yet harm has found him, said Holmes grimly, and it moves with method. Come, Watson. There will be a train within the hour. The death at Brighton. By noon we were standing in a small lodging house near the Brighton seafront. The sea mist had crept inland, giving the narrow rooms an air of ghostly damp. Quarles lay upon his bed, his face peaceful, too peaceful, save for the same terrible mark, the right eye filmed with that unnatural silver sheen. Holmes examined him closely, saying nothing. The local inspector, a florid man with an unfortunate moustache, watched with evident discomfort. No sign of struggle, sir, he said. Door locked from inside, window fastened, fire burnt low, as if he'd sat here half the night. There's a looking-glass on the wall. Thought nothing of it, but you may wish to see. We followed him to the opposite side of the room. A small mirror hung above the washstand, its surface faintly clouded with age. Holmes leaned close and froze. There, visible even to my untrained eye, was a pale impression, as though the ghost of a handprint lingered upon the glass. He breathed out slowly. He was not alone when he died. Someone, or something, stood behind him. The inspector snorted. Begging your pardon, sir, but there's no sign anyone entered. Holmes did not reply. He drew from his pocket a small magnifying lens and began to examine the surface of the mirror inch by inch. At last he straightened, his expression unreadable. It is not residue, Watson. It is etched into the glass itself. A perfect outline of a human hand. Heat, perhaps, or light. Then someone used an instrument? Or an eye? Holmes murmured. An eye that sees through glass and leaves its mark behind. The house by the sea. That evening we dined in silence at a small inn overlooking the shingle. Holmes ate little, his gaze fixed upon the dark horizon where sea and sky merged into one unbroken void. At last he spoke. Watson, do you recall Mrs. Sloane's confession? She claimed to have destroyed the formula, yet if these deaths continue, the formula must have survived. Or the principle has escaped destruction. Ideas, like contagions, seldom die cleanly. You believe someone continues Penhaligon's work. I believe the work continues itself. I stared at him in alarm. Holmes, you speak in riddles. He gave a weary smile. Then let me be plain. The mirror remembers, as I told you. But perhaps it also teaches. What if once exposed to the principle of its design, a man's very vision becomes the instrument? What if the eye, human or glass, becomes the conduit of reflection? He paused, and for a long moment the only sound was the steady hiss of the tide. You mean, I mean, said Holmes quietly, that whoever looks too long into that kind of mirror may carry its power thereafter. They become, in effect, a walking lens, seeing through glass as the motto proclaimed. Quarles, Dunwoody, perhaps even Penhaligon, and now perhaps another. His gaze drifted toward the window pane beside us, where our reflections sat in spectral outline against the dark. There is still one man unaccounted for, he said. The tall foreigner, the one Quarles glimpsed in his shop. I believe he has followed the experiment from its birth, and means now to complete it. The man in the mirror. It was close to midnight when the door of our chamber creaked open. A gust of cold air swept through, extinguishing the lamp. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "Who's there?" he demanded. A low voice answered from the darkness. "One who has seen too much, Mr. Holmes." The match flared in Holmes's hand, casting its frail circle of light. And there, framed in the doorway, stood a tall man in a dark traveling coat, his features obscured by shadows save for one gleaming eye. A glass eye glimmering with a faint inner light. "Dunwoody," I gasped. The stranger smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. "Dunwoody is dead. I am what he saw." Holmes did not move. "You have been following us since Lambeth," he said. "You killed Quarles." The man inclined his head slightly. "He freed me, as you soon shall." He stepped forward, and as he did, the lamplight caught his eye full on. It glowed, not merely reflected, but emitted light like a miniature sun. The room was filled with its pallid shimmer, and for an instant I thought I saw, within that gleam, 100 faces. Penhaligon's, Dunwoody's, even my own, swirling like trapped souls in a silver vortex. Holmes seized the poker from the hearth. "Watson! The lamp!" I swung it upward, shattering the chimney glass. Flame leapt. The intruder recoiled with a hiss like steam. In that moment Holmes struck, the poker descending in a single terrible arc. There was a crash, not of bone but of shattering glass. The man, or what remained of him, collapsed to the floor. His right eye had burst, scattering fragments that smoked faintly where they fell. When the fumes cleared, only an empty socket stared upward, and the faintest reflection of our two faces shimmered upon the fragment nearest the fire. Holmes knelt, his voice low and strained. "So ends the man behind the mirror." I was too shaken to reply. The fragment seemed to pulse with an inner light, before fading into darkness. Aftermath. We buried what remained of the intruder with the local authorities' consent. There was no name to give him, no country to claim him. Lestrade's telegram the next day merely read, "Case closed. No further incidents reported." Holmes, however, did not treat it as closed. For days he wandered the sitting room like a man pursued by invisible reflections, the curtains drawn and every mirror in the house covered. At last he spoke. "The experiment has ended," he said, "but the principle remains. You cannot unsee what has once been seen, Watson. The danger is not in the glass, but in the mind that looks through it." He paused, and I noticed with a sudden chill that his eyes seemed darker than usual, as though shadowed from within. "Still," he added with a faint attempt at levity, "we may safely say that for once Inspector Lestrade is looking into matters no further, and that, my dear fellow, is a mercy." He turned away then to stare into the fire, and in its trembling light I could not help but imagine that somewhere deep within those sharp grey eyes there flickered a glint of silver, like the dying echo of a reflection that refused to fade. Chapter 9. The Shadow Beyond. Baker Street. In all my long association with Sherlock Holmes, I can recall but few occasions when he betrayed even the faintest sign of fear. Yet in those days which followed our return from Brighton, I saw a change in him that I could not mistake. He had become restless, irritable, and prone to sudden silences, the sort of haunted introspection I had observed once before, after the case of the Devil's Foot. The fog had lifted from London, leaving behind that raw, colourless air peculiar to early winter. Our sitting-room, however, seemed perpetually dim. Holmes had ordered every mirror covered, from the mantelpiece to the small shaving-glass in his bedroom, with sheets of black cloth. The effect was funereal, and it seemed to me that Baker Street had itself become a mausoleum of reflections. For my own part, I tried to bring some sense of normalcy to our existence. The morning papers, a pot of tea, a few words about a patient or the progress of my notes. But Holmes barely listened. He spent long hours at his microscope or bending over small fragments of glass which, though I swore I had seen him destroy, seemed to multiply upon his desk like cursed seeds. The letter without a seal. It was on the morning of the 21st of November, a date I remember with singular clarity, that a letter arrived without postmark or seal. Mrs. Hudson, pale and trembling, brought it in herself. "Beg pardon, Doctor," she said, "but the man who handed this over, well, he was standing right outside the door, and when I turned round again he was gone. Vanished, sir." Holmes took the envelope without a word. The paper was fine and faintly perfumed. the handwriting a narrow, elegant script that leaned slightly to the left. He broke it open and read aloud, "Mr. Holmes, you have looked too far and seen too much. The glass is never empty. Return what was taken, or the reflection will claim its due." There was no signature, only a small symbol at the bottom of the page, the all-seeing eye. Holmes studied it for a long moment. "So," he said softly, "the Ordo Speculorum is not yet content." I leaned forward. "You think this a threat?" "I think it an invitation," he replied, folding the letter. "Watson, the time has come to meet our watchers face to face." A journey by night. That evening we were in a hansom rattling eastward through the warren of streets beyond the Strand. Holmes had received a second communication, a brief note delivered by Boy instructing him to come alone to the disused glassworks at Limehouse before midnight. "You mean to walk into their trap?" I asked as the cab jolted through the fog. "I mean to look through it," he said, with that grim play upon words which so often prefaced his most dangerous ventures. "If we are to end this business, we must see who stands behind the mirror, in every sense." We reached Limehouse shortly before midnight. The glassworks was a ruin, a gaunt skeleton of brick and iron, its windows broken, its interior lit only by the faint phosphorescence of the Thames beyond. A rusted sign creaked in the wind. Holmes dismounted lightly, motioning for silence. "Keep close, Watson. No light until I give the word." We crept through the shattered doorway. The air within was thick with dust and the acrid scent of chemicals long stale. Then, as our eyes adjusted, we saw that the central floor had been cleared, swept of debris, and upon it stood a single table. Upon that table, lit by a single lamp, was a great mirror. It was no ordinary glass. Its surface shimmered faintly as though it breathed. The circle of eyes. A voice spoke from the shadows. "You are punctual, Mr. Holmes." From the darkness beyond the lamp emerged 5 figures, all cloaked, their faces obscured by veils of gauze. Each wore upon the breast a small medallion bearing the emblem of the radiant eye. They moved with the slow precision of ritual. Holmes stood motionless. "You honor me," he said coldly. "The Ordo Speculorum, I presume." "The order needs no name," said the foremost figure, a man of commanding height whose voice carried the trace of an Eastern accent. "You have trespassed upon our domain, Mr. Holmes. The knowledge you destroyed was not yours to extinguish." "The knowledge," Holmes returned, "was poison. It killed Penhaligon, destroyed Dunwoody, and now haunts even your disciples. What use is a mirror that devours its makers?" The man laughed softly. "You speak as one who has already seen. Do you deny, then, that you felt the gaze? That you carry it now?" Holmes's hand twitched, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. "I deny nothing," he said quietly. The leader gestured toward the great mirror. "Then look again, detective. The reflection accepts no denial." The others stepped aside. The mirror's surface seemed to pulse, the light deepening until it resembled a pool of black water. Holmes advanced a pace. "Stay back," I whispered, catching his arm. He shook me off gently. "If truth is there, Watson, I must see it. The mirror's secret." He leaned forward, gazing into the glass. For a long moment nothing happened. Then I saw, or thought I saw, his reflection shift. It no longer matched his movements. When he raised his hand, the image lagged. When he stepped forward, it smiled, a grim, knowing smile that Holmes himself did not wear. Holmes recoiled sharply, color draining from his face. "Do you see?" the leader said. "It is not a reflection. It is memory. The glass remembers every eye that has ever looked into it. Dunwoody, Penhaligon, Quarles, and now you." Holmes drew himself up, mastering his fear. "Then it remembers also the folly of men who sought to see too much. I see only a gallery of ghosts, and the living fools who join them." In one swift motion, he seized the lamp from the table and hurled it against the mirror. There was an explosion of flame and glass, a scream from the robed figures, and a blinding white flash that seared my vision. When my sight returned, the chamber was a chaos of smoke and fire. The mirror lay shattered, its fragments glimmering like embers. The figures of the order had vanished. Only Holmes remained, standing before the wreckage, his face lit by the dying glow. "It's finished," he said hoarsely. "They are gone." But even as he spoke, a faint light pulsed within the largest fragment at his feet. Not the reflection of the flames, but something deeper, colder, alive. He bent toward it, and I saw, reflected there, not his face, but mine. I caught his arm. "Come, Holmes. The place will collapse." He started as if waking from a trance, and together we fled into the night as the timbers groaned and fell behind us. The Shadow. Returns to Baker Street. By dawn, the fire had consumed what remained of the glassworks. The police called it an accident, though the constables who found us wandering the embankment at first light swore that the river itself shimmered with reflections long after the flames had died. We returned to Baker Street exhausted and grimy. Holmes said little. He ordered every mirror in the flat to remain covered, and for the rest of that day he sat before the fire, his eyes half closed, a strange light flickering in their depths. Once I thought I heard him murmur almost to himself, "The glass remembers, but does it also dream?" I said nothing, for in the polished lid of his violin case, though every mirror in the room lay veiled, I fancied I saw again that faint, impossible shimmer, as though even in our refuge, something unseen still watched from the other side of the glass. Chapter X. The Dreaming Glass. For several days following our return from Limehouse, Holmes's condition caused me grave concern. His energy, once inexhaustible, seemed to ebb away as though drawn from him by invisible threads. He spent long hours sitting motionless before the fire, his violin untouched, the ashes of his pipe collecting in grey drifts about the hearth. At times I caught him gazing at the covered mirrors with a curious intensity, as if, even through their shrouds, they might yet return his stare. The papers, of course, were full of the Limehouse conflagration. "Mysterious fire in disused glassworks," proclaimed the Chronicle. "Secret society suspected." There were rumors of bodies found in the ruins, though no official report confirmed it. Lestrade, in one of his rare visits, declared the matter closed. "Good riddance to bad rubbish," was his verdict. "The Yard's happy to let that lot burn themselves out." But Holmes was not content. He kept the blinds drawn day and night, as though the faintest reflection might betray him. The midnight disturbance. It was near midnight when I was roused from uneasy sleep by a sound from the sitting-room, a faint metallic note like the vibration of a tuning fork. I rose, threw on my dressing-gown, and stepped quietly to the door. Holmes sat before the fire, but the fire had long since burned to embers. The sound came from the corner where his violin lay, its strings trembling as though plucked by invisible fingers. "Holmes," I began, "what on earth—" He lifted a hand sharply. "Listen." The note deepened, resonating through the room. Then unmistakably a faint whisper seemed to rise from the air itself. Not speech, but something like breath drawn across glass. It grew louder until the covered mirrors quivered in their frames. "Holmes," I exclaimed, "what is this?" His face was pale, his voice calm. "It is the echo." "Watson, the memory that remains. The mirror may be broken, but it dreams still." As he spoke, one of the black coverings stirred, as if by a passing draught. A corner fell away, and for an instant the polished surface beneath caught the firelight. And something else. I saw reflected there the faint image of Holmes, but not the Holmes who sat beside me. This reflection was smiling. With a swift movement, Holmes seized the cloth and flung it back over the glass. The sound ceased at once. "You see," he said quietly, "it is not only memory that persists. Reflection itself is contagious." He sank into his chair, his hands pressed to his temples. "They called it the dreaming glass, Watson. Penhaligon's final term for the perfected lens. He meant it to capture not image but consciousness. When one looked into it, it did not merely record, it mirrored the mind. That is why those men died as they did. Their own thoughts turned upon them. I stared at him in horror. And you looked into it too. He gave a faint smile. Yes, and since that night I have not dreamed as other men do. When I close my eyes I see faces, fragments, 1,000 flickering memories that are not my own. I have become, as it were, a part of the mirror. Holmes's experiment. The next morning he announced, with the calm precision of a man describing a surgical operation, that he intended to repeat the experiment. It is the only way, Watson. I must know whether the effect resides in the glass or in the observer. If in the former, it is destroyed. If in the latter. If in the latter, I interrupted hotly. You risk your reason. He regarded me kindly. My dear fellow, you exaggerate. A little risk sharpens the wits. Fetch me the silver nitrate from my reagent shelf. Reluctantly I obeyed. Holmes set to work with steady hands, coating a fragment of ordinary glass with the solution. He placed it before the fire until the surface took on a faint shimmer. Then, positioning his chair opposite, he sat down and stared into it. For 10 minutes he did not move. Then slowly he began to speak. I see. The river, he murmured. Fog upon the water, and faces beneath the surface. Penhaligon, Dunwoody, they are calling. His voice faltered. None, not calling. Watching. He rose abruptly, his face ghastly pale, and dashed the glass to the floor. Enough, he cried. The vision is not in the glass. It is in the mind. They have built a mirror inside me. The physician's dilemma. For 2 days thereafter, Holmes neither ate nor slept. I grew desperate. At last, fearing for his sanity, I sent a note to his brother Mycroft, imploring him to intervene. But before any reply could arrive, the crisis came. It was on the 3rd night. The wind moaned about the chimneys, and the city lay steeped in darkness. I had dozed in my chair when a sound woke me, the slow, deliberate lifting of a cloth. I sprang up. Holmes stood before the mantel, one of the veiled mirrors uncovered. His reflection gazed back, not as a copy, but as a presence distinct, independent. Holmes! I shouted. He did not turn. Do you not see, Watson? He is waiting. The reflection, the one who looked back in Limehouse. He was never destroyed. Step away from it, I cried, rushing forward. But even as I reached him, the mirror's surface rippled. The reflected Holmes smiled, that same cold, knowing smile I had glimpsed before, and extended a hand. Holmes recoiled, his eyes wide with horror. The glass shimmered like liquid. I seized the poker and struck the mirror full force. It shattered, the fragments falling like rain. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Holmes collapsed into my arms. The awakening. He awoke the next morning, weak but lucid. Watson, he said faintly, you have once again saved me from my own folly. The reflection, it was my own mind staring back, magnified and distorted by obsession. The true danger was not in Penhaligon's invention, but in the temptation it offered, to see beyond what nature allows. He smiled, wanly but genuinely. Burn the fragments, everyone. Let there be no more dreaming glass in this world. I obeyed. The shards turned black in the flame, curling like paper, until nothing remained. Epilogue. The mirror's dream. Weeks passed. Holmes recovered his vigor, and our life resumed its accustomed rhythm. Yet there were moments, fleeting, subtle, when I caught in his eyes a strange, reflective glint, as if the light itself paused there before passing on. One evening, as he tuned his violin, I ventured to ask whether he had truly been free of visions since that night. He smiled. Entirely, my dear Watson. Though, he added lightly, I sometimes fancy that when I play, the notes echo more sweetly than before, as if the sound remembers itself. He lifted the bow. The first notes filled the room, low, resonant, haunting. I sat back, content, until I noticed, quite by chance, that the polished curve of the violin's body caught the firelight, and in that fleeting reflection I thought I saw two faces, mine and his. But the second smiled, and then it was gone. Chapter 15. The Music of Reflections. It was in the bleak closing days of November when that final phase of the glass-eyed affair unfolded. A chapter which, though less violent than those that preceded it, chilled me more deeply than any I had yet known. For it was not the physical danger that now threatened us, but something subtler, older, and infinitely more insidious. The slow encroachment of the unseen upon the living mind. Holmes had recovered in body. He walked again with his characteristic energy, and from the casual observer's point of view, he was much his usual self. Lean, keen, and untiring, he resumed his correspondence, his experiments, and even took a minor case concerning a stolen snuff-box, which he solved in an afternoon merely to prove to Lestrade that he could. And yet, to me, who had come to read the smallest flicker of his expression as plainly as I might a line of print, there was a difference. His laughter came less readily, his silences lasted longer. Often, when I entered the room unexpectedly, I would find him standing quite still, gazing not at anything in particular, but at the air itself, as though the world before him were not quite real, or as though he were listening to something inaudible. The violin's whisper. It was on one of those dark, still evenings, when London lay wrapped in fog and the lamps glowed like blurred halos, that I first heard what I can only call the whisper in the strings. Holmes had taken up his violin after supper, more, I think, from habit than inclination, and began to play a soft, meandering air. The notes drifted languidly at first, the sort of half-conscious improvisation he sometimes indulged in while thinking. I was writing at my desk when I noticed a faint tremor in the sound, a strange undertone that did not seem to belong to the melody. I looked up. Holmes was playing with eyes half closed, his face illuminated by the firelight, the bow moving with delicate precision, but beneath the violin's singing voice there came another tone, lower, slower, like an echo following the main theme by a fraction of a beat. I rose quietly, thinking some peculiarity of acoustics was at work. But as I crossed the carpet, I realized that the echo came not from the room, but from the violin itself. Each note Holmes played seemed to answer itself. He stopped abruptly, lowering the bow. "You heard it too, Watson?" "I did," I said. "But what was it?" Holmes stared at the instrument in his hands. "I do not know. It began a week ago when I restrung the bridge, a resonance beyond the fundamental. Curious, is it not?" He set the violin aside. "No matter. We will speak no more of it tonight." But I knew from the tension in his voice that he would speak of little else again. The return of the reflection. The next morning I found him hunched over his microscope. Upon the stage lay what appeared to be a wood shaving no larger than a thumbnail. "From the violin," he said without looking up. "A sliver from the inner surface. Look, Watson." I bent to the eyepiece and saw, impossibly, a sheen across the grain, faint and silvery, like mercury threaded through the wood. "Surely that is some residue from your chemical tests." He shook his head. "No. The violin has not left this room since it was repaired. Do you remember, Watson, what I told you of Penhaligon's final formula? The so-called dreaming glass. He sought to create not reflection, but remembrance. What if, by some whim of fate, a trace of that principle survived in this house, and settled upon the varnish, the very surface of the violin?" I could find no reply. He smiled thinly. "You recall, of course, the last words I spoke to you before I collapsed. The mirror dreams. I thought then it was my imagination. Now I wonder whether it was, in fact, a statement of fact. For what is music, Watson, but the sound of air reflecting upon itself? Perhaps this instrument has learned to remember its own song." He rose and began to pace. "If so, we may have stumbled upon something even Penhaligon never conceived, a mirror not of sight but of sound, an echo that endures beyond the moment of its making. The experiment. Despite my protestations, Holmes resolved to investigate the phenomenon that same evening. He arranged the room with scientific precision, curtains drawn, lamps shaded, instruments at the ready. "I shall play," he said, "a simple arpeggio. You, my dear Watson, will record what you hear, and if, when I cease, the music continues, we shall have proof." He began to play. The melody was spare, haunting, almost mournful, a rising and falling pattern like a breath. I noted the time carefully. The air was utterly still. Then, as the final note hung trembling, he lowered the bow. Silence. And then, softly, impossibly, the phrase repeated itself. Not upon the strings, for Holmes's hands were still. Not from any echo, for the curtains were drawn. It came from somewhere deeper, as though the very air remembered. Holmes's face lit with grim triumph. "You hear it?" "I hear something," I whispered. "Then it is true. The resonance of the dreaming glass persists. It has imprinted itself upon matter, upon sound." His voice broke with a strange mixture of awe and dread. "Do you not see, Watson? This is what Penhaligon sought, to make memory physical, every tone, every thought preserved." The sound faded, and Holmes lowered the violin to his side. "We must end this," he said quietly, "before it learns to play without me." A visitor from the yard. The next day brought Lestrade. He entered briskly, rubbing his hands. "I trust you're done with that cursed mirror business, Mr. Holmes. The yard's washing its hands of it." Holmes inclined his head. "Then the yard shows more wisdom than I, Inspector, for the case is not yet finished." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Then you'll finish it alone. I've no taste for ghosts in looking-glasses." As he left, Holmes watched him go with a peculiar expression, part amusement, part pity. There goes the last man in London who still believes reality is confined to what he can arrest. That evening he played again, softly as though in defiance. The violin's tone was pure and steady, until the final chord, when once more the echo came. But this time it did not fade. It grew. The melody rose of its own accord, swelling in perfect imitation of his playing. The bow slipped from Holmes's fingers. The violin continued. He backed away slowly, eyes wide. "Watson, it remembers." The burning of the violin. I seized the instrument, meaning to silence it. The instant my hand touched the wood, a shock ran through me, a vibration not of sound, but of thought. I saw, as in a flash, images. The fog of Lambeth, Penhaligon's terrified face, Dunwoodie's gleaming eye, the shattered mirror. The air itself seemed alive with memory. Holmes snatched it from me and thrust it into the fire. The flames caught at once, leaping blue, then white. A strange sweetness filled the room, like burning resin. When it was done, nothing remained but a handful of blackened strings and a smell faintly of ozone. Holmes sank into his chair, trembling. "It is finished," he said hoarsely. "The last reflection has been silenced." Coda London awoke the next morning to a sky of pale gold. Holmes, after a long sleep, was himself again, quiet, rational, though infinitely weary. "There are two kinds of mirrors, Watson," he said as we breakfasted, "those that show the world as it is, and those that show the world as it remembers itself. We have looked into both, and been lucky to escape with our eyes unclouded." He stirred his tea thoughtfully. "There will be others, of course, men who think they can capture memory or conscience or life itself in glass or sound or color. But they will learn, as Penhaligon did, that the truest reflection lies not in what is seen or heard, but in what is forgotten." He smiled then, a true smile, warm and human. "Now, my dear fellow, I believe I shall take a holiday. There is, I am told, excellent trout fishing in Hampshire. Let the glass dream without us." And so ended the case of the glass-eyed man, not with the report of a pistol or the rattle of a hansom in pursuit, but with the quiet crackle of a fire and the faint echo of a violin that would play no more. Chapter 2. The Mirror and the Mind. It was a week or more after the burning of Holmes's violin that I began to hope in earnest that the affair of the glass-eyed man had at last been laid to rest. London itself seemed to breathe easier. The fogs that had so long haunted our footsteps lifted. A rare, fragile winter sunlight crept across Baker Street, and Holmes, though pale and thinner than I liked, resumed his customary rhythm of study and indolence, alternating between furious activity and long brooding stretches of silence before the fire. He never again spoke of mirrors, nor of sound that remembered itself, but at times, when the afternoon light fell across the room, I noticed him glance almost unconsciously toward the veiled mantelpiece, as though expecting the cloth to stir. He would smile faintly, shake his head, and turn again to his papers. It was clear that he meant, by an effort of will, to bury the past. I, too, longed for such peace, and for a time it seemed we had succeeded. Yet fate, or something older and less merciful, had not quite finished its reflection of us. The return of a familiar name. One morning, while I was engaged in sorting through my notes of the recent tragedy for the purposes of eventual publication, the post arrived with an envelope addressed in a neat, foreign hand. Holmes, who had been reading at the window, tore it open absently. The paper was heavy, faintly tinted with blue, and bore the seal of the French Sûreté. Monsieur Holmes, permit that I recall our brief acquaintance in Paris some years ago. It may interest you to learn that certain papers relating to an English invention of optical nature, bearing the name Penhaligon, have lately come to our attention. These were discovered in a trunk purchased at auction from the estate of a deceased chemist. The diagrams are incomplete, yet one bears an inscription, "To be perfected only by the one who sees through another's eye. I would value your counsel as to its authenticity. Inspector Dubosc, Sûreté Nationale." Holmes read the letter twice, then let it fall upon the table. "Watson," said he, "the shadow lengthens again." I sighed. "Do you mean to pursue it?" He gave a short, sardonic laugh. "Pursue it? No, but we cannot pretend that the ghost is laid until we know by what road it travels. Fetch my hat. France, I think, owes us an explanation." Paris and the lost trunk. Within 48 hours we were in Paris. The city was wreathed in early winter mist, the Seine glinting coldly between the bridges. At the Sûreté, Inspector Dubosc, a small, keen man with the alert manner of a terrier, received us with Gallic courtesy and barely concealed curiosity. He produced the trunk, a battered iron-bound chest, its lock newly forced. Within lay several rolls of parchment, brittle with age, and a handful of brass instruments, lenses, screws, and a cracked ocular tube. Holmes examined the papers under the light. "This," he said softly, "is indeed Penhaligon's hand. See here, the spiral notations, the shorthand formulae for reflection and refraction. But this addition, 'to be perfected only by the one who sees through another's eye,' that is not his. The ink differs. The phrasing is foreign." Dubosc inclined his head. "We thought so. It appears to be the work of a man called Ernst Haydn, a Prussian physicist once employed by your optician Quarles." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then Quarles was not the final link. Haydn. I have read of him. A recluse, obsessed with the notion that perception itself is divisible, that one mind might, through optical means, share the sight of another." He turned to me. "Do you see, Watson? The Ordo Speculorum was but one branch of a wider tree. They sought unity of vision. The perfect observer who sees through all eyes at once, the glass-eyed man, the mirror that dreams, all mere experiments along the way." The Laboratory of Shadows. At Holmes's insistence, we accompanied Dubosc to the small suburban villa where Haydn had lived and died. The place stood at the edge of Montreuil, a forlorn building, with boarded windows and a garden choked by weeds. Inside, the air was thick with dust and chemical fumes long settled. We found in the upper room a kind of workshop. A wooden chair stood before a tall contrivance of lenses and wires, part telescope, part camera obscura. At its center, mounted like an idol, was a small round mirror of black glass, Holmes bent over it with evident caution. "Obsidian," he murmured. "Volcanic, ancient, not man-made." He gestured for me to bring the lantern closer. The mirror's surface drank the light, reflecting nothing. Yet as we moved, faint shapes began to glimmer across its depths, indistinct, shifting like silhouettes behind smoke. Dubosc crossed himself. "Mon Dieu, it moves!" Holmes remained motionless. "Yes," he said quietly. "It moves. But only because we do. This is no optical trick, Watson. It is a negative reflection, the absence of light arranged to mimic form. Haydn sought to create the eye of darkness, the lens that sees not light but thought." He turned sharply to the inspector. "Destroy it." Dubosc hesitated. "But surely, monsieur." "Destroy it," Holmes repeated, "or Paris will find itself haunted by its own imagination." The inspector, overawed, summoned his men. Within minutes the apparatus lay in pieces, the black mirror shattered by the butt of a rifle. Yet as we descended the stairs, I fancied I heard from somewhere above a faint sound, not of breaking glass, but of something sighing, as though released. The philosophy of seeing. We dined that night at a quiet café near the Rue de Rivoli. Holmes was unusually reflective, if one may use so ironic a word. He spoke little, but when he did, his tone had none of his old irony. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever wondered what sight truly is? Not merely the act of perceiving, but the consciousness behind it. When I observe a footprint in the mud, I see, by inference, the man who made it, his height, his weight, his occupation. But the mirror, the dreaming glass, invites another kind of seeing. It asks one to become the other mind. That is its blasphemy." I nodded gravely. "And Haydn?" "He failed, thank God. For had he succeeded, there would be no more secrets, no more individuality. Humanity would be but one vast reflection, endlessly observing itself. The perfect vision, and the death of all privacy." He raised his glass of wine, though he did not drink. "We have destroyed the mirror twice, Watson. Once in Lambeth, once in Montreuil. Let us hope there is no third." The farewell of the glass. We returned to London after a week. Holmes was silent on the journey, gazing out the window as the grey fields slid by. Only when we reached Baker Street did he seem to rouse himself. "Watson," said he, "you will of course write this up, but not yet. Let the world forget the glass-eyed man and his heirs. One day science will reinvent the same peril under another name, and men will call it progress. Until then, silence is the better safeguard." I promised him that I would wait. That night, as I retired, I passed by the sitting-room door. Holmes sat by the fire, his violin upon his knee, his face calm and thoughtful. The flame-light danced upon the polished wood of the instrument. A new one, recently acquired. For an instant, I could have sworn it. The light caught the curve of the varnish, and a second reflection stirred there, faint as breath, looking not at Holmes but at me. I blinked. It was gone. Holmes did not look up. He merely said, in that gentle, weary voice which always marked the end of a case, "Sleep well, Watson. The night is clear, no fog, no mirrors." And with that he drew the bow across the strings. The music rose, pure, untroubled, and achingly human. So ended the long and terrible history of the glass-eyed man, a tale of sight and blindness, of truth glimpsed and wisely forgotten. Yet even now, when the lamps burn low and I hear a violin echo faintly through the London night, I sometimes fancy that somewhere, deep within that melody, the glass still dreams and remembers. Chapter 3. The Silent Watcher. The long winter that followed our return from Paris proved one of the quietest seasons I can recall in all my association with Sherlock Holmes. London lay under a pall of low cloud, its streets shining with frost, its lamps burning pale through the mist. Within the familiar walls of Baker Street, life resumed its customary rhythm: tea at 7, correspondence at 8, and the sound of Holmes's violin drifting faintly from the sitting-room long after midnight. Outwardly, it might have seemed that the shadows cast by the glass-eyed affair had finally retreated into memory. Yet beneath that veneer of calm I sensed in Holmes a subtle change, more profound than illness and deeper than melancholy. He was quieter, yes, but not idle. His gaze, once restless and analytic, had grown distant, not the absorption of a thinker lost in deduction, but the abstraction of a man listening to something unheard. I once asked him if his mind was occupied with a new case. He gave a short laugh. "A case, my dear Watson?" "No, a condition. The curious circumstance of a man who knows that the world may be an optical illusion and must live as if it were real." Then, catching my alarm, he added more gently, "Forgive me. The mirror leaves one philosophical aftertaste. That is all." The visitor in the fog. It was near the year's end when an unexpected caller roused the quiet of our household. A heavy snow had fallen, muffling the street and turning the lamps into halos of mist. We were seated by the fire when a firm knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, bearing a card upon a tray. Holmes took it and raised an eyebrow. Inspector Lestrade. I had begun to think him a myth of Scotland Yard folklore. The inspector was ushered in, stamping the snow from his boots and shaking the cold from his coat. His familiar sharp features wore a look half apologetic, half perplexed. "Beg pardon for intruding, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but I've a matter that, well, the men at the Yard thought it might tickle your fancy." Holmes gestured toward the hearth. "You seldom bring me trivialities, Inspector. What corpse has refused to stay buried this time?" Lestrade hesitated. "None, sir. Not a corpse. Not yet, anyhow. But there's something queer afoot at the National Gallery. Night watchmen swear they've seen a figure walking in one of the closed rooms. A reflection, as it were, without a source. Appears only in the glass of certain display cases. Never in the same one twice." I felt a chill run through me. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. A reflection without a body. How poetically inexact, and how uncomfortably familiar. Lestrade spread his hands helplessly. "They think it's a trick of the light. I'd say so myself if the same shadow hadn't been caught by the cameras. No body, no man, just, well, something in the glass." Holmes was silent for several seconds. When he spoke, it was in that soft tone I had come to dread. "When did it begin?" 3 weeks ago. Always after midnight. The attendants call it the Watcher. Some of them have quit outright." "The Watcher," Holmes repeated. He rose abruptly. "Watson, your coat. The night grows interesting." The gallery at midnight. We arrived at the National Gallery near midnight. The porter, pale and nervous, admitted us without protest. He led us through the echoing halls, our footsteps muffled upon the marble. The gas lamps flickered against the gilt frames of Turner and Constable, casting long, tremulous shadows across the silent masterpieces. Lestrade's voice was a hoarse whisper. "This way, Mr. Holmes. The apparition favors the east wing, the old portrait gallery." Holmes said nothing. His face, half lit by the lamps, had taken on that familiar aspect of keen absorption I had not seen for weeks. Yet there was something else there too, an unease he did not trouble to hide. We reached the long corridor. The air was bitterly cold, though no window was open. A dozen glass display cases lined the walls, each containing minor relics, sketches, palettes, scraps of frame. The porter halted and pointed. "There, sir. That's where it showed itself last. In the glass of that case." Holmes approached slowly. The light glimmered faintly across the surface. For a moment nothing stirred. Then, almost imperceptibly, the reflection of Holmes's own face shifted. He froze. I saw it too. The image in the glass was smiling. Holmes drew a long, steady breath. "Watson." "Fetch your revolver." I obeyed, my hands trembling. But as I turned back, the smile had vanished. The reflection was once more his own. Lestrade muttered an oath. "It's witchcraft, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. "No, not witchcraft. Persistence. Memory imprinted upon the surface. The last echo of the dreaming glass, reborn in another form." He ran his gloved hand lightly across the case. "You see, Inspector, The National Gallery purchased a number of experimental lenses from the late Penhaligon's estate some years ago. They were used to enhance illumination, perhaps even reflection. It appears one of them has remembered too much. The reflection moves. He knelt to examine the edge of the case. A faint residue of mercury nitrate, the same compound Penhaligon used. The glass has developed what I might call a memory of perception. It reflects not what is before it, but what it has once seen. Lestrade blinked. Then this shadow, is nothing but a recollection, said Holmes. Yet recollections can be dangerous things when they do not know they are dead. At that instant the light flickered. The air grew colder still, and from the far end of the corridor came a faint sound, not footsteps, but a soft tapping, as of knuckles upon glass. We turned as one. Every pane along the gallery shimmered faintly, as though lit from within. Then in each a figure appeared, tall, indistinct, yet horribly familiar. A man with one shining eye. Dunwoody, I breathed. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. Stand fast. Do not look directly into it. The reflections moved closer, their forms flickering like candlelight upon water. For a heartbeat they filled the glass. Then, as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. The corridor was empty. Lestrade stumbled back, white-faced. I'm finished with this, Mr. Holmes. Finished. You can keep your ghosts. Holmes watched him go. Then very softly he said, Not ghosts, Watson. Remnants. The glass has learned to dream again. The silent watcher. We returned to Baker Street in silence. The first light of dawn crept over the city, cold and colorless. Holmes stood by the window, his profile etched against the grey sky. It follows a law, you see, he murmured. The mirror cannot die while the mind that looked into it survives in memory. So long as one man remembers, the reflection endures. The world itself is a hall of mirrors. He turned toward me then, and in the pale morning light I saw something that chilled me more than any apparition. For in his eyes, those brilliant, restless eyes that had seen through every disguise and deception, there lingered, just for an instant, a faint metallic gleam. Then it was gone, and he smiled his old weary smile. Come, my dear fellow, we have survived worse illusions. The world will not end because one mirror remembers. Yet even as he spoke, I knew he did not believe it. Epilogue to the chapter. The National Gallery closed that wing for repairs within the week. The papers made no mention of the incident. Life on Baker Street resumed its steady rhythm. The clink of teacups, the scratch of Holmes's violin bow, the murmur of handsome wheels upon the fog-bound street. But sometimes, when the light is low and I pass the window at dusk, I fancy I see him still. A tall figure standing motionless by the glass, his head slightly bowed, his gaze fixed upon something only he can see. And as the firelight flickers across his face, it seems to me that Holmes himself has become what he once hunted, the silent watcher, forever peering into the depths of his own reflection, listening for the faint music of the dreaming glass. Chapter 14th. The Vanishing Reflection. The case that the public would one day call the glass-eyed affair might well have ended with that strange visitation at the National Gallery. But fate, or some darker hand, seldom permits Sherlock Holmes a tranquil conclusion. I had hoped, after the silent watcher incident, that Holmes would allow the matter to fade into the background of legend, as many of his cases have done. Yet I should have known better. There was a glint in his eyes, not of triumph, but of something unresolved, almost haunted. The winter passed into a brittle, colorless spring. Our work resumed its ordinary course. Clients with jealous wives, vanishing jewels, and blackmailers who lacked imagination. Yet even amid the trivialities, I often caught Holmes gazing absently at the fogged window panes of Baker Street, his long fingers tapping the sill in slow rhythm, as though listening to the echo of a sound only he could hear. One evening, After the close of a tiresome domestic case, I found him thus, seated by the hearth, his violin resting across his knees. The firelight threw his shadow tall upon the wall, a perfect silhouette, motionless save for the faint rise and fall of his breath. He spoke without turning. "Watson, do you believe that a shadow can outlive the man who cast it?" I looked up from my notes, startled. "You mean metaphorically, Holmes?" "Perhaps not." He smiled faintly. "A shadow is but the absence of light shaped by the body that blocks it. But what if the body itself becomes unnecessary? If light learns to cast its own?" "Holmes," I said, "you are perilously near to poetry." "Or madness," he replied, still smiling. "It is a narrow bridge between the two." A message in silver. It was 3 nights later when Mrs. Hudson brought up the evening post. A single envelope, heavy, unmarked, its surface faintly glimmering as though brushed with fine metallic dust. Holmes, who was trimming his lamp, held the letter to the light. No seal, no watermark. Curious. He slid it open with his penknife. A single sheet slid out, bearing only a line of elegant script. "The reflection fades when the watcher sleeps." Holmes frowned, turning the paper over. "Invisible ink, perhaps," he murmured. He held it closer to the lamp, and at once the faint dust upon its surface shimmered. The words vanished. In their place appeared another phrase, faint, silver gray, like writing seen through frost. "Haydn lives." We stared at one another. "Haydn," I whispered. "But he died years ago. You saw his laboratory destroyed." Holmes's gaze darkened. "So I believed. Yet if any man could survive his own experiment, it would be one who had learned to see through others' eyes. Come, Watson. The game returns to the board." The shadow in the glass. Our first clue came from Inspector Dubosc's follow-up telegram from Paris, which reached us 2 days later. It confirmed that Haydn's body had never been officially identified. A witness, a maid who attended the villa, swore that she had seen her master leave the house that same evening, carrying a small mirror wrapped in cloth. The next morning the place had been found in ruins. "Then the laboratory we destroyed was but a shell," Holmes said grimly. "The true apparatus, his obsidian lens, must have survived." "Holmes," I said uneasily, "surely you don't mean to pursue this?" "My dear fellow, the question is not pursuit. It is containment. If Haydn has indeed preserved Penhaligon's work, then London is once more a hall of mirrors, and one man somewhere is standing at the center. The house in the fog. Our search led us to Wapping, that old haunt of fog and river damp, where the warehouses stand like blind giants along the wharves. An informant, one of Holmes's numerous agents in the underworld, had reported a foreign lodger recently taken rooms above a disused glass factory on Pennington Street. We arrived just after dusk. The fog clung thick around the gas lamps, and the air smelt of tar and cold iron. Holmes examined the pavement with his lantern, tracing footprints, heavy-soled, narrow-gated. "A man accustomed to confinement," he murmured. "See the toes. They turn inward, the walk of one who seldom meets the sun." The door to the warehouse was ajar. Holmes motioned for silence and drew his revolver. We climbed a narrow stair to the upper room. A single candle burned upon a table. Before it, propped against a wall, stood a small mirror covered by black velvet. Holmes advanced cautiously. "Haydn," he called. No answer. He reached for the cloth and froze. "Watson," he whispered. "The candle." Its flame burned steady, yet its reflection in the glass flickered as if disturbed by wind. He dropped the cloth. The mirror's surface was no longer black but luminous, a deep shifting silver alive with motion. Within it, faint and wavering, stood the image of a man, tall, spare, bald, the very likeness of Haydn, though his features were drawn and hollow, as if half formed from smoke. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes," said the image. The voice was calm, distant, yet filled the room as though spoken from the air itself. Holmes stood rigid. "So you persist." "I am persistence," the image replied. "You destroyed my body, but not my sight. I see through you now, through all who have looked into the glass. You are my eyes." Holmes's hand tightened on his revolver. "You forget, sir, that eyes may be closed." He fired. The glass shattered. The sound was unlike any I had heard. Not the ring of breaking mirror, but a low, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate through the bones. The candle guttered out. When the smoke cleared, the mirror was gone, not shattered on the floor, but gone as though it had sunk into the wall itself. Holmes stood very still, the revolver smoking in his hand. "He is finished," he said quietly. Yet his voice trembled. "And yet, I think he has taken something with him." The vanishing reflection. We left the warehouse in silence. The fog pressed close around us as we hailed a cab. It was only when we reached Baker Street that I noticed it. As Holmes hung his coat, his shadow upon the wall seemed oddly faint, almost transparent. "Holmes," I said uneasily, "you are pale. Sit. You look unwell." He smiled faintly. "No, Watson, not unwell, only diminished." "Diminished? Do you not see? When I fired, the reflection did not merely vanish. It transferred. Haydn sought to merge observer and observed. He has done so. Some part of me, perhaps the part that looked too long, remains behind that glass." "Holmes, this is madness." "Perhaps." He sank into his chair, staring into the fire. "But I feel it, a quietness, as though a second self has been extinguished. I am, in a sense, less than I was." "And yet," he hesitated, "and yet freer." The final reflection. For weeks thereafter, life resumed its ordinary shape. The newspapers mentioned a mysterious explosion at a riverside warehouse, but nothing more. The case was officially closed. One evening I entered the sitting room to find Holmes standing before the window, his reflection faint in the glass. The city lay beyond, fog and lamplight, endless and unknowable. He turned to me with a strange gentleness. "Watson," he said, "if ever you write this case, and I know you will, do not call it the story of the glass-eyed man, nor of mirrors and ghosts. It is the story of seeing, of what happens when one looks too long into truth. The mirror did not kill those men. It merely showed them themselves." He smiled, a weary human smile that dispelled for a moment the lingering dread. "Now come, my dear fellow. There's a storm coming over the river, and Mrs. Hudson's supper grows cold." I followed him, glad of the warmth and the light. Yet as I turned to close the shutters, I caught one last glimpse of his reflection in the window. Or thought I did. For just an instant the glass showed two figures where one stood. Then the fog rolled past, and the second shape was gone. Thus ended the case of the glass-eyed man, a tale I have long hesitated to set upon paper, for fear it might be taken as the delusion of an aging physician, or the nightmare of a man too long in the company of a genius who gazed always beyond the veil. Whether Holmes truly lost some fragment of himself in that final confrontation, or whether it was but my own imagination playing tricks upon a weary mind, I cannot say. But sometimes, when the fog drifts low across Baker Street, and the firelight glimmers faintly upon the window, I fancy that if I were to look long enough into that dim reflection, I might yet see him there, lean, ascetic, eternal, the silent watcher who once saw too much, and learned at last that some truths are best left unseen. Chapter 15. The Final Observation. It is a melancholy fact that the longer one lives in the company of genius, the more one learns that triumph and tragedy are often twin reflections of the same flame. In the early months of the year 1890, as the last traces of the glass-eyed affair faded from public recollection, I believed that Holmes had at last shaken free of its darker associations. Yet, as ever, I mistook composure for peace. The city was greening again, handsome wheels splashed through spring rain, and London had begun to hum with its customary industry. Our sitting room on Baker Street was bright with sunlight for the first time in months. Holmes had taken to wearing his dressing gown of Persian blue once more. A small detail, but to me it signified recovery. Yet there were moments when, catching him unaware, I saw that same faraway look steal over his countenance, the expression of a man listening to the silence beyond sound. The mirrors remained covered. I did not press him to uncover them. The case of the missing astronomer. One morning in early April, while I was examining a patient, Holmes received a visitor, a tall, angular man with an astronomer's stoop and the anxious eyes of one accustomed to studying infinities. I found them seated by the fire when I returned. "Watson," said Holmes, "permit me to present Professor Aldous Greening, lately of the Royal Observatory. He has brought us a matter which, though it masquerades as a simple disappearance, bears the unmistakable perfume of reflection." The professor inclined his head. "A colleague of mine, Dr. Lionel Ashe, vanished last week. We found his observatory locked from within, his telescope intact. But the lens, gentlemen, the great lens itself, was blackened as though by fire. On the wall behind it, where no light could reach, there appeared the outline of a human figure, burned or perhaps etched into the plaster." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Etched by light that should not exist. Continue, Professor." "The police think it an accident with the photographic plates," said the man. "But Ashe had lately been corresponding with the late Edmund Dunwoody. Your name appears in his notes, Mr. Holmes, about some optical principle. He spoke of a mirror that sees." "Thought it nonsense until I saw that wall." Holmes rose with sudden energy. "The final experiment," he murmured. "Watson, it appears the dreaming glass has found a new pupil." The observatory on the hill. We journeyed that afternoon to the outskirts of Greenwich, where the disused observatory stood upon a low rise overlooking the river. The air smelled of rain and stone. Gulls circled overhead like fragments of torn paper. Inside, the chamber was cold and silent. The telescope loomed like a cannon aimed at heaven. Holmes examined the great lens with meticulous care, running his fingers along its rim. "Do you see, Watson?" he said quietly. "A thin layer of silvering upon the inner glass. Not soot, but deposition. The same mercury compound Penhaligon used. Dr. Ashe has repeated his work upon a grander scale." We turned toward the rear wall. There, unmistakably, was the outline the professor had described. The faint, perfect silhouette of a man, arms slightly raised as though reaching toward the telescope. The edges glimmered faintly in the gloom. Holmes stooped, his expression unreadable. Not burned, but imprinted. The man's image, his very presence, fixed upon the wall like a negative. He looked through the lens when it turned from earth to sky. The dreaming glass has shifted its gaze from man to the heavens. He straightened abruptly. "Watson, do you realize what this means?" He tried to make the sky itself a mirror. A glimpse of the infinite night fell as we examined the dome. Holmes, ever the experimenter, could not resist aligning the telescope. He adjusted the dials, peered into the eyepiece, and beckoned me forward. "Look," he said simply. I hesitated. The memory of Lambeth's horrors still lived in me, yet his tone brooked no argument. I bent to the glass. At first I saw only the stars, pinpoints of silver across a fathomless dark. Then, slowly, they began to move. Or rather, my own reflection began to move among them. I saw my face, ghostly and pale, suspended in the void, and behind me another, Holmes's, watching intently. Then his image turned, though the man beside me had not. I recoiled with a cry. Holmes caught my arm. "Steady, Watson. It is but the mind's echo, the same trick that haunted Dunwoody's eye. The heavens reflect what we bring to them." "But you saw it," I gasped. "I saw what I expected to see," he said quietly. "And perhaps that is the greatest danger of all, that the mirror shows not truth, but belief." He covered the lens with a cloth. "Come, the stars will keep their secrets tonight." The last deduction. We left the observatory before dawn. The first light broke over the Thames like tarnished silver. Holmes walked in silence, his coat drawn tight against the chill. At last he spoke. "Watson, I have been wrong. My dear Holmes. Wrong in assuming that the dreaming glass was a curse confined to its makers. It is, rather, a mirror of mankind's condition, our unending hunger to see what lies beyond our sight. Penhaligon, Dunwoody, Haydn, Ashe, each sought knowledge, not evil. Yet in their pursuit they looked past wisdom into madness. The mirror did not corrupt them, it merely obeyed." He paused, gazing eastward where the river flamed under the rising sun. "It is not the mirror that dreams, Watson, but the mind, and perhaps the truest sanity is to turn one's gaze away." I said nothing. The wind off the water stirred the hem of his cloak, and for a fleeting instant his reflection shimmered upon the wet cobbles at our feet, thin, wavering, almost transparent. Holmes smiled faintly. "Do you know, my dear fellow, I sometimes think that if all the mirrors in the world were shattered, men might begin to see one another clearly for the first time." The final reflection. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes packed away the last of his instruments. The covered mirrors remained untouched. The fire burned low, and he sat beside it, the shadows dancing upon his face. "You intend to publish nothing of this, Watson," he said suddenly. "Promise me." "I promise," I said, though my hand trembled. He nodded, satisfied. "Good. Let the dreaming glass sleep. There are enough illusions in the world without my adding to them." He poured 2 glasses of brandy, handed me one, and raised his own. "To sight," he said. "To sight," I echoed. The fire crackled softly. For a time neither of us spoke. Then Holmes rose, stretched his long limbs, and stood by the window. Outside, the fog was gathering once more, dimming the lamps along Baker Street until they glowed like ghosts in the mist. Holmes looked out into the grey. "Strange," he murmured, "how the fog obscures the world, and yet in its way spares us from seeing too much." He turned back with a small smile. "Come, Watson, the night is clear enough within these walls." And so it ended, the long pursuit of light through glass, of truth through reflection. Holmes never again spoke of the matter, but sometimes when the fog rolls thick and I see his shadow fall across the hearthrug, I fancy it lingers a moment too long after he has moved, as though the mirror of the world, reluctant to forget, still remembers the man who once dared to look through it. Chapter 15. The Final Curtain. It is with no small measure of hesitation that I set down this last chapter in the strange chronicle of the glass-eyed man. There are matters here that test the boundary between reason and imagination, between the solid world and that ghostly realm of reflections in which, I fear, my old friend was destined to dwell. Though years have passed since those events, I confess that even now a certain unease attends the memory of them. Holmes, for his part, never alluded again to the dreaming glass, or to the horrors which had sprung from its invention. He returned to his customary pursuits with renewed vigor, cases of fraud, espionage, and theft, which once more brought his brilliant faculties to bear upon the tangible world. Yet for all his apparent restoration, I knew that something indefinable had changed within him. His mind, though as sharp as ever, had acquired a new stillness, a contemplative quality foreign to his nature. He worked now not to prove his intellect, but as if to distract himself from something unseen, a memory perhaps that lurked at the periphery of his thoughts like a phantom just beyond the reach of the lamplight. The storm over London. It was in late May, some 6 weeks after our return from Greenwich, that a great storm swept across London, the most violent I had seen in many years. The sky turned almost black at midday, and thunder rolled like cannon fire over the Thames. The city shuddered under the onslaught. Lightning forked over the rooftops, illuminating the river with sudden spectral brilliance. Holmes, curiously enough, appeared invigorated by the tempest. "Nature," he remarked, pacing before the window, "is the only true mirror. She reflects everything, and nothing." I smiled, though uneasily. You have become a philosopher, Holmes. He turned toward me. Perhaps it is safer to be a philosopher than a visionary. Before I could reply, the room was suddenly illuminated by a flash of lightning so blinding that for a moment I saw nothing but white. When my vision cleared, I beheld Holmes standing absolutely still by the window, his hand pressed to the glass. "Watson," he said softly, "come here." I rose, alarmed by the tone of his voice. He did not turn as I approached. "What is it?" "Look," he whispered. Outside, the street was empty. The rain poured in silver sheets, yet upon the wet surface of the glass, just for an instant lit by the lightning's afterglow, there appeared another hand pressed against his own from the outside. Then it was gone. The visitor in the rain. The following morning, Mrs. Hudson informed us that a gentleman had called during the storm, leaving no name but a card of strange design. Holmes examined it under the lens. It bore no lettering, only a faint engraving of an eye surrounded by concentric rings. "The Ordo Speculorum," he murmured. "Still they linger." "You think the order survives?" I asked. "I think," he said, "that ideas are harder to kill than men. When a man dies, his image remains, not only in glass, but in the minds of those who looked upon him. And ideas are nothing but reflections of reflections." He placed the card in the fire. "Let us leave it there." The case of the vanishing light. For several nights thereafter, Holmes worked late into the small hours, examining nothing more dangerous than the remains of a cigar ash or the footprint of a burglar. But one evening I woke to a sound I had not heard since that dreadful winter, the long, low note of the violin. I went to the sitting room and found him standing by the hearth, bow in hand. The melody was unlike any I had ever heard, not mournful nor sweet, but eerily balanced between the two, as if poised upon the edge of remembrance. The firelight glowed upon his face, and in his eyes there burned a curious, reflective light. "Holmes," I said quietly, "that tune, what is it?" He lowered the bow. "Something of my own making, Watson. A study in echoes." He smiled faintly. "Do you hear it?" "The melody?" "No. The space around it. The silence that follows each note. That is the true music." He set the instrument aside and sank into his chair. "You once asked me whether I feared madness. I do not. Madness is only the mind's reflection turned inward. What I fear," he said, gazing into the fire, "is the possibility that I might vanish entirely. Not die, you understand, but dissolve, like smoke against a mirror." The final observation. The last act of this strange history took place a few days later. A messenger brought word from Inspector Lestrade that Professor Greening, the astronomer who had first summoned us to Greenwich, had been found dead in his study. The manner of death was peculiar. The blinds drawn, the lamp extinguished, and upon the wall opposite his desk a faint, luminous outline of his own face, as though impressed by light. Holmes said little. He merely dressed with his customary precision and bade me accompany him. The professor's house lay in Bloomsbury. The body was as described, slumped before a darkened window. The faint outline upon the plaster shone softly even in the lamplight. Holmes examined it in silence. At last he turned to me. "The contagion has spread." "You mean the mirror's curse?" "I mean perception itself. Every man who looks too deeply into his own image sees something that should not be seen. The dreaming glass was but the first instrument. The human eye is the last." He drew the curtain over the window and turned away. "Come, Watson. There is nothing more to learn here." The quiet departure. In the days that followed, Holmes grew uncommonly gentle in his manner, almost affectionate, though still reserved. He took long walks through Regent's Park, sometimes standing motionless by the lake for an hour, staring into the shifting reflections of clouds upon the water. Once, I ventured to ask what occupied his thoughts. "The simplest of questions," he said. "Whether the reflection of the sky upon water is more real than the sky itself. Perhaps the one exists only because the other observes it." I laughed. You are becoming quite the mystic, Holmes. Perhaps, he said softly. But mysticism, my dear Watson, is merely logic seen from the other side of the glass. The final curtain. It was in early June that Holmes vanished. There was no struggle, no sign of departure. His pipe lay cold upon the mantel, his violin in its case. The fire had burned low. Only one thing was out of place. The curtain over the window had been drawn aside. When I approached, I saw my own reflection gazing back, and behind me, faint and wavering, another. Holmes's tall, lean figure, his head slightly inclined as if in perpetual thought. I turned, but the chair was empty. I searched the room, the building, the street. No trace of him was ever found. Scotland Yard concluded that he had left for the continent on some secret errand. I allowed them their explanation. Yet I knew, as surely as I have ever known anything, that Sherlock Holmes had at last stepped beyond the mirror's reach, into that place where observation ends and reflection begins. Epilogue. The glass at dawn. Years have passed since that night. I have grown older, slower, perhaps a little more inclined to dream. The world has changed, electric light has replaced the gas lamps, and London has grown louder, brighter, and less mysterious. But sometimes, in the still hour before dawn, when the rain runs down the window and the city sleeps, I see upon the glass a faint image, tall, lean, and motionless, his face illuminated by a light that is not of this world. Then, as the day breaks, the image fades, leaving only the reflection of an old man with a pen in his hand. Yet I cannot help but feel that somewhere, beyond sight, beyond even reason, Holmes still watches, the eternal observer, the guardian of the unseen truth. And if ever again London's fog grows thick and its mirrors begin to dream, I know he will return, as inevitable as thought, as silent as light, to remind us that the world itself is but an endless case, waiting to be solved.